Gideon Hale thought 12 cents would buy him peace. Instead, it bought him a war. The moment he saw her hanging from that gate beam 7 feet of Apache fury, left to die in the desert sun, he knew his cheap land came with a price written in blood. They strung her up to hide their sins. They murdered the man before him for knowing too much. Now Gideon stood between corruption and justice, with nothing but a rifle and a woman too angry to stay dead. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this legend travels. The August sun beat down on Liberty like God's own hammer, turning the dirt streets into rivers of heat that made the air shimmer and dance. Gideon Hale sat outside the courthouse on a bench that had seen better decades, his hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much and hoped for too little. In his weathered hands, he held everything he owned in the world 12 cents. 3 nickels, 2 pennies, and a copper cent, so worn you could barely make out Lady Liberty's face. 12 cents between him and absolutely nothing. He'd lost the ranch 6 months back, not to drink or cards or any of the usual demons that took men down in the West, just to time and bad luck, and a drought that killed his cattle one by one until there was nothing left but sun-bleached bones scattered across land that wasn't his anymore. The bank took it all with apologetic smiles and ink-stained fingers, and Gideon had been drifting ever since picking up odd jobs sleeping in stables, wondering when exactly he'd stopped being a man and started being a ghost. The courthouse doors swung open with a groan that matched the building's age. Hiram Teague, the county clerk, stepped out mopping his bald head with a handkerchief that might have been white once but was now the color of old tobacco spit. "Any takers?" someone called from the shade of the general store across the street. "Not a damn one," Teague hollered back. "Property's cursed, everyone knows it. Can't give the thing away." Gideon's head came up slightly. Property no one wanted. That was the kind of thing that interested a man with 12 cents. He stood joints popping and crossed the street. His boots, held together more by habit than leather at this point, left prints in the dust that the wind erased before he'd taken 3 steps. "What property?" Gideon asked. Teague looked him up and down with the particular expression men reserved for those who'd fallen far. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He knew Gideon knew what he'd been, knew what he was now. "The Hartwell place," Teague said, stuffing the handkerchief in his pocket. 12 acres northwest of town, cabin-well barn that's mostly standing. Been on the auction block for 6 months. Judge ordered it sold for back taxes. He paused, eyes narrowing. "But there's bad history there, Hale. Real bad." "I've got bad history of my own," Gideon said. "How much?" Teague laughed, a short, sharp bark with no humor in it. "That's the thing. Owed 17 cents in taxes. Nobody's bid a single penny. Everyone in 3 counties knows—" "I'll take it," Gideon interrupted. The clerk's eyebrows climbed toward where his hairline used to be. "You don't even know what happened there." "Don't particularly care," Gideon said. It was half true. The full truth was that a man with 12 cents couldn't afford to care about ghosts or curses or whatever kept other folks away. "How much for a winning bid?" Teague studied him for a long moment. Around them, Liberty went about its afternoon business wagons, rolling past chickens pecking in the dust. Old man Sawyer arguing with his mule outside the livery. Normal life, the kind Gideon used to have. "Minimum bid's got to be enough to clear the debt," Teague finally said. 17 cents. Gideon's heart sank. He came up 5 cents short. Might as well have been $500. But then Teague did something unexpected. He glanced left, then right, then leaned in close. "Tell you what," he said quietly. "Judge Crane's been trying to get this property into certain hands, specific buyers, if you catch my meaning. But the law says it's got to go to public auction, and the law says I've got to accept any legitimate bid." He paused. "You give me those 12 cents, I'll mark the tax debt as paid in full. Clerical error. Happens all the time." "Why would you do that?" Gideon asked. Something dark moved behind Teague's eyes. "Because I knew Sam Hartwell." "Good man. And what happened to him?" He trailed off, shook his head. "Sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. You got 12 cents or not." Gideon did. He placed the coins in Teague's palm one by one. The clerk counted them, nodded, and produced a document from inside his jacket. "Sign here," he said, Property transfers immediately. And Hale, don't go into town bragging about this. Some folks won't be happy. Who? The kind of folks you don't want unhappy, Teague said. He waited while Gideon scrawled his name on the deed, his handwriting shakier than he liked proof of how long it had been since he'd had cause to sign anything important. One more thing. If you find anything at the cabin, anything that doesn't seem like it belongs, you come find me. Not the sheriff. Not Judge Crane. Me. Understand? Gideon didn't understand, not really, but he nodded anyway. Teague handed him the deed and a key that looked older than the territory itself. It's yours, the clerk said. May God have mercy on you. Gideon walked away from the courthouse, a landowner again. Broke hungry and probably foolish, but a landowner. He had no horse, couldn't afford to keep one fed, so he started walking northwest out of Liberty with the deed folded in his pocket and the ancient key hanging from a leather cord around his neck. The August heat pressed down like a physical weight. The road such as it was cut through prairie grass that whispered secrets to itself in the hot wind. To the north mountains rose blue and distant Apache territory, where few white men traveled without good reason or bad judgment. Gideon walked for an hour, then two, keeping the sun on his left and following what Teague had described as the old trading route. He saw the cabin before he saw the trouble. It sat in a shallow bowl of land surrounded by cottonwoods that had somehow survived whatever drought the rest of the territory suffered through. The cabin itself was log-built, sturdy-looking despite years of neglect. The barn behind it leaned to one side like a drunk trying to remember which way was up. A well stood between the buildings, its bucket still hanging from the rope. And beyond it all, 12 acres of land that could grow things, could support cattle, could be alive again. Gideon felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or its cautious cousin. Then he saw the gate. 2 posts stood at the property's entrance, rough-hewn timber 12 feet tall, with a crossbeam between them. From that crossbeam, hanging by a rope around her neck, was a woman. But not just any woman. She was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with shoulders broader than most men Gideon had known. Her buckskin dress was torn and bloodied, dark stains spreading across leather the color of dry earth. Her head hung forward, long black hair obscuring her face, arms bound behind her back with rawhide that had cut deep enough to leave her wrists raw and bleeding. Gideon's first thought was that she was dead. His second thought was that this was why nobody bid on the property, not a curse but a body left as a warning. His third thought died when she moved. It was barely perceptible, just a slight shift of her shoulders, a rattling gasp that might have been breath. But it was enough. Jesus Christ, Gideon whispered and broke into a run. He reached the gate posts in seconds, looking up at her with his heart hammering. Up close she was even larger than he'd realized, and younger too, maybe 25, with features that marked her as Apache. Her skin was burnt copper in the sun, her face swollen from exposure and abuse. The rope around her neck was tight, but not tight enough to immediately kill whoever hung her, meant for her to die slowly. "Can you hear me?" Gideon called up. Nothing. Just that faint, terrible breathing. He looked around frantically. The crossbeam was too high to reach, and he had no ladder. The rope was thick, too thick to break with his bare hands. He pulled the key from around his neck, no use. What he needed was a knife, and his knife was in his pack, and his pack was... His eyes found a wagon wheel leaning against the barn, half buried in weeds. Gideon ran. His legs, already tired from the walk, protested. His lungs burned. But he grabbed that wheel and dragged it back to the gate, propped it against the post, and climbed. The wood was rotted in places and nearly gave way twice, but he made it high enough to grab the rope. "I've got you, he said, knowing she probably couldn't hear. "Just hold on." He pulled his knife, a cheap thing bought from a traveling merchant blade, dull enough that it took 3 tries to saw through the rope's first strands. His hands shook. Sweat ran into his eyes. The rope was rough hemp, tough as old leather, and every second felt like an hour. The woman made a sound, low-pained, barely human. "Almost there," Gideon muttered. "Almost." The rope snapped. She fell hard, her massive frame hitting the ground with an impact that raised dust. Gideon scrambled down and dropped to his knees beside her knife. Forgotten hands moving to the noose around her neck. It had pulled tight when she fell. He worked his fingers under it, felt her pulse weak, thready, but there, and pulled. The noose came free. She gasped a huge rattling breath that sounded like life being dragged back from whatever dark place it had been heading. Her eyes snapped open. They were dark as midnight and full of something Gideon couldn't name. Pain, yes. Rage, absolutely. But underneath it all, something else. Recognition, maybe, or memory. "You're safe," Gideon said. The words felt stupid even as he said them. Nothing about this was safe. "I'm going to cut your hands free." He moved around behind her, sawing at the rawhide binding her wrists. It was wet with blood and swollen into her skin. When it finally parted, her arms dropped to her sides like dead weight. "Can you stand?" She didn't answer. Instead, she rolled to her hands and knees, a movement that looked like it cost her everything, and vomited into the dust. When she finished, she stayed there, head hanging, breathing hard. Gideon waited. He'd learned a long time ago that you couldn't rush a person back from the edge of death. They came back on their own time, or not at all. After what felt like forever, she spoke. Her voice was raw, wrecked by the rope, but clear enough. "Why?" One word, simple, but loaded with weight Gideon couldn't begin to measure. "Because leaving you there wasn't an option," he said. She lifted her head enough to look at him. Up close, despite the swelling and damage he could see, she was striking sharp cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes that held intelligence and fury in equal measure. "You are the new owner," she said. Not a question. "Just bought it an hour ago," Gideon admitted. "For 12 cents. Something might have been amusement flickered across her face, gone so quick he couldn't be sure. 12 cents. And now you will die for it." "People keep telling me about the bad history of this place," Gideon said. "Nobody's mentioned the details." "Samuel Hartwell owned this land," she said. Each word seemed to cost her. "Good man. He found proof documents that show the judges and the governor forged Apache land deeds, stole territory, broke treaties." She paused, breathing hard. "He was going to expose them. They killed him, burned him in his barn." Gideon glanced back at the barn, which suddenly looked less like it was leaning and more like it had been damaged. "When 4 months ago. And you—" "I am Nayeli," she said. "Granddaughter of Chief White Hawk. They hung me here to send a message to my grandfather: stay silent or lose everyone you love, one by one." Gideon felt ice water run through his veins despite the heat. He'd stumbled into something way bigger than a 12-cent bargain. This wasn't just about a cabin or some land. This was conspiracy, murder, tribal politics, and corruption that reached all the way to the territory's highest offices. "We need to get you inside," he said. "Out of this sun. Can you walk?" "I can do what I must," Nayeli said. She pushed herself to her feet, an agonizing process that took minutes, but she refused his offered hand. When she finally stood, she towered over him, maybe 6 inches taller, and despite the damage, she radiated a kind of power that made Gideon reassess everything he thought he knew about strength. They made their way to the cabin slowly. Each step looked like torture for her, but she took them. Gideon unlocked the door with Teague's key, pushing it open to reveal a single room thick with dust and shadow and the smell of abandonment. A bed frame without a mattress stood against one wall. A table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, cold and dark. And in the corner, pushed half under the floorboards, Gideon spotted something that made his blood run cold. A bullet hole in the wall. Then another. Then 3 more. This was where Samuel Hartwell made his last stand. Nayeli sank onto one of the chairs, her massive frame making it creak alarmingly. "You should leave," she said. "Ride out tonight. They will come for me. They will kill you just for finding me alive." "Who's they?" Gideon asked. "Fletcher Knox, the governor's enforcer. Silver-hatted devil who does the dirty work while judges smile and shake hands." She touched her throat where the rope had burned it raw. "He hung me himself, laughed while he did it." Gideon moved to the fireplace, found a water bucket that still held liquid, stale and warm but wet. He brought it to her along with a relatively clean cloth he found hanging from a nail. "Drink slow." She did, taking small sips while he dampened the cloth and handed it to her for her wrists. "The documents," Gideon said. "The proof Hartwell found. What happened to it?" "Hidden," Nayeli said. "Somewhere in this cabin. He told my grandfather before they killed him said the truth was here in the 12-cent cabin. We thought it was a riddle, a code. My grandfather sent me to search." Her jaw tightened. Knox's men were waiting. They knew I would come. So the documents might still be here. Yes. She met his eyes. And that is why they wanted the land. Why they killed Hartwell. Why they tried to kill me. Why they will kill you. She paused. "You should have spent your 12 cents on whiskey, white man. At least you would have died happy." Gideon almost smiled. Almost. "Name's Gideon. Gideon Hale." "Gideon Hale," she repeated, testing the words. "Do you know what you have done by cutting me down? You have declared which side you stand on. There is no walking away now." "Wasn't planning to walk anywhere," Gideon said. "I just got land for the first time in 6 months. Figure I'll stay and see what it's worth." "It is worth your life," Nayeli said bluntly. "Knox will come. If not tonight, then tomorrow. He will bring men. They will not ask questions or offer bargains. They will burn this cabin to ash with you in it." "Then I guess we better find those documents first," Gideon said. He began searching. The cabin wasn't large, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, but there were 1,000 places to hide something. Floorboards that could be pried up. Walls that might have hollow spaces. The fireplace with its stone chimney. Even the roof beams overhead. "Hartwell was a lawyer," Nayeli said from her chair. She hadn't moved, still recovering, but her eyes tracked Gideon's search. Careful man. Precise. He would not hide something in an obvious place. "What makes a place obvious?" Gideon asked, tapping floorboards. "Anywhere someone searches first," she said. "Under beds. Behind loose stones. In empty jars." She paused. He was also practical. He would want the documents findable by the right person, but invisible to the wrong ones. Gideon straightened thinking. A lawyer's mind. Precise, careful, practical. He looked around the cabin again, trying to see it through different eyes. The bed frame drew his attention, not because it was obviously hiding something, but because it was the only furniture that looked like it had been moved recently. Drag marks in the dust, faint but visible if you looked close. He crossed to it, gripped the frame and pulled. It was heavier than expected, solid oak built to last. He managed to shift it enough to reveal the floorboards underneath. Nothing. Just wood and dust and a spider scrambling away from the light. "Not there," Nayeli confirmed. "But he moved it," Gideon said. "Recently. Why?" "To make people think he hid something there," she suggested. "A false trail." Smart. Gideon circled the room again, looking for other signs of disturbance. His eyes caught on the fireplace. The stones were blackened with soot from years of use, but one section looked different, cleaner somehow, like it had been scrubbed or replaced. He knelt and examined it closer. 3 stones in the lower section of the chimney, each about the size of a man's head, fit together in a pattern that looked deliberate. He pressed on the first. Nothing. The second. Nothing. The third shifted slightly under his hand. "Here," he said. Nayeli tried to stand, winced, and settled back. "Show me." Gideon worked at the stone, finding purchase points, pulling. It resisted, then suddenly gave way with a grinding sound. Behind it was a hollow space, and in that space was an oilskin package wrapped tight and sealed with wax. His heart hammered as he pulled it out. The package was maybe 10 inches square and an inch thick. Heavy. The wax seal bore no mark, but the oilskin looked new, nothing like the decades-old dust coating everything else. "Open it," Nayeli said. Gideon broke the seal. Inside was a folder made of thick leather, and inside that were papers. Lots of papers. He spread them on the table, deeds, surveys, letters, official documents bearing territorial seals and signatures that even Gideon recognized. Governor Webb's name appeared again and again, so did Judge Crane's, and a dozen other names, officials and businessmen and politicians. "What am I looking at?" Gideon asked. Nayeli rose, finally, swaying slightly but determined. She crossed to the table and studied the documents with eyes that had gone hard as flint. "Proof," she said simply. "Apache land grants from before the territory was organized, treaties signed by the federal government, and here she tapped one document wishing forgeries. Deeds that claim the Apache lands were purchased legally, but see the dates. These transactions supposedly happened before the treaties were even signed. Impossible. And these Gideon indicated letters. Correspondence between Governor Webb and Judge Crane discussing the scheme, how to divide the stolen land, who gets what percentage. They are not even careful about it. They thought these papers would never see daylight. Her voice dropped. 10,000 Apache people pushed onto reservations. Families, starved children dead from disease warriors forced to watch their land stolen acre by acre, all based on lies. And here, she slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make the papers jump, is the proof. Gideon felt sick. He'd known there was corruption everyone knew, but seeing it laid out in black and white with signatures and seals and casual cruelty was different. These weren't just crimes, this was theft on a scale that broke nations. We need to take this to a marshal, he said. Someone outside the territory, someone Webb can't reach. The sound of hoofbeats cut him off. Both of them froze. The beats were distant but approaching multiple horses moving fast. Gideon moved to the window. The glass was so filthy he could barely see through it, and caught glimpses of riders coming up the road from Liberty. Knox, Naeli said. Not a question. How many men does he usually bring? Gideon asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. Enough. The riders came into clearer view. Gideon counted 6 No-7 mounted men in trail dust and gun leather, moving with the easy confidence of people who'd done violence before and expected to do it again. Leading them was a figure in a white hat that caught the late afternoon sun and threw it back like a mirror. Silver hat, Naeli had said. But it looked white from here, and somehow that was worse. They slowed as they approached the gate, the place where Naeli had hung hours before. Gideon saw the leader Knox. It had to be Knox stand in his stirrups and stare at the empty crossbeam. Even from this distance, Gideon could see the moment understanding hit. She wasn't there. Someone had cut her down. Knox's head turned slowly, scanning until his eyes fixed on the cabin, on the window where Gideon stood. They made eye contact across 100 yards of prairie grass. Knox smiled a white flash in a sun-darkened face and touched the brim of his hat in mocking salute. Then he kicked his horse and started forward at a walk, his men falling in behind him in a line that looked almost military in its precision. "They're here to kill us," Naeli said from behind Gideon, "both of us, and burn the cabin with the documents inside." "Then we better not make it easy for them," Gideon said. He turned from the window. "Can you shoot?" "I am Apache," she said, as if that answered everything. Maybe it did. "There's got to be weapons here. Hartwell wouldn't have lived out here without—" He started searching again, more frantically now. Found nothing, then remembered the barn. "Stay here. Keep away from the windows." "Where are you going?" "To find us some teeth," Gideon said, and slipped out the back door. The barn was worse than it looked from outside. Half the roof had caved in, and the smell of old smoke was strong enough to make Gideon's eyes water. This was where they'd killed Hartwell, where they'd tried to erase him and his evidence together. Charred support beams stood like blackened bones. The hayloft had collapsed into the stalls below. But in the corner, under a scorched tarp, Gideon found what he needed: a Winchester rifle oiled and clean, a Colt revolver with a full cylinder, boxes of ammunition for both, a shotgun with a broken stock useless, and something else, sticks of dynamite old but maybe still functional, wrapped in oilcloth alongside caps and fuse. Hartwell had been preparing for war. He just hadn't survived to fight it. Gideon loaded his arms with everything he could carry and ran back to the cabin. The riders were closer now, 50 yards out, still walking their horses, but spreading out into a line that would let them hit the cabin from multiple angles. Inside, Naeli had moved the table to barricade the door. She'd also torn strips from her already ruined dress to bind her wrists properly. When she saw the Winchester, something fierce and bright lit in her eyes. "Give me the rifle," she said. Gideon handed it over along with a box of cartridges. She checked the action with practiced hands, nodding approval. He took the Colt for himself and positioned himself at the window he'd looked through earlier. The riders had stopped. They sat 30 yards out in a loose semicircle backlit by the lowering sun. Knox remained in the center, his silver hat gleaming. He was maybe 40, Gideon guessed, with the kind of face that might have been handsome if it wasn't so cold. He wore double pistols on a gun belt decorated with silver conchos, and when he smiled, it didn't touch his eyes at all. "You in the cabin," Knox called out. His voice carried easily smooth as oiled leather. "I'm going to make this real simple. Send the Apache woman out and you can walk away. Take your 12 cents and go drink yourself stupid in liberty. We'll even let you keep the deed, sign it over after the fact, call it legal." Gideon didn't answer. "Not a talker," Knox said. "That's fine. I like the strong, silent type." He shifted in his saddle. "Here's the thing, though. That woman you cut down, she's property of the territorial government held on charges of trespassing and theft. You interfered with official business. That makes you a criminal." "Since when does the territorial government hang prisoners without trial?" Gideon called back. Knox's smile widened. "Since we needed to send a message. But I can see you're not getting it, so let me speak slower. That woman is a hostage. Her grandfather has something that belongs to Governor Webb legal authority, over 10,000 acres of prime land. We're conducting negotiations, and you just complicated those negotiations by getting heroic." "Is that what you call it?" Gideon asked. "Negotiations. Diplomacy with teeth," Knox said. "But here's the good news. You still got a choice. Send her out, take your land, live your life. Hell, I'll even throw in $500 for your trouble. That's a good offer for a man who bought this place with pocket change." $500. It was more money than Gideon had seen in 2 years, enough to stock the land, buy cattle, start over properly. All he had to do was hand over a woman he'd known for all of 2 hours to men who would absolutely kill her the moment they had her. Not a hard choice at all. "Tell you what," Gideon said. "Why don't you and your boys ride back to Liberty, tell the governor his dirty secrets are about to come out, and maybe spend the evening making peace with your maker? Because you're not getting the woman, you're not getting the documents, and you're sure as hell not burning this cabin down." The silence that followed was so complete, Gideon could hear the wind moving through the cottonwoods. Then Knox laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a church. "You found them," he said, delighted. "Hartwell's papers, I'll be damned. We've been looking for 4 months, tore this place apart twice, and you," he pointed at Gideon, "you walk in and find them in an afternoon. That's just beautiful." "Glad I could help," Gideon said. "Oh, you helped all right. You helped me understand that we're done negotiating." Knox's hand dropped to one of his pistols. "Boys, the structure burns. Everyone inside dies. And if those documents turn to ash, well, that was the plan all along." "That's murder," Gideon said. "That's Tuesday," Knox replied. He looked at his men. "Light it up." 2 riders immediately swung down from their horses, pulling torches from saddlebags they'd come prepared. They lit them with matches that flared bright in the gathering dusk and started forward toward the cabin. Gideon glanced at Naeli. She'd positioned herself at a different window, the Winchester steady in her hands, despite her injuries. She caught his look and nodded once. "When they get close," she said quietly. The men with torches approached cautiously, spreading out to hit the cabin from 2 sides. Behind them, Knox and the others drew weapons, revolvers gleaming in the torchlight. This was it. The moment everything went from bad to hell. 20 feet, 15, 10. "Now," Naeli said and fired. The Winchester's crack shattered the evening. The man on the left went down with a scream, his torch flying from his hand to land in the dirt where it burned uselessly. Gideon fired a heartbeat later, his Colt bucking in his hand. He missed rust and nerves conspiring against accuracy, but the second man dove for cover, his torch forgotten. Then everything exploded into chaos. Knox's men returned fire muzzle flashes blooming in the dimness like deadly flowers. Bullets punched through the cabin's walls, whining and buzzing like furious hornets. Gideon threw himself flat, returning fire through the window. Naeli worked the Winchester's lever with mechanical precision, each shot deliberate, each one finding purchase. Another scream, another man down. "They'll circle around," Naeli shouted over the gunfire. "The back door!" Gideon was already moving. He reloaded the Colt as he ran, burst through the back door, expecting to find riders flanking. Instead, he found 2 men on foot creeping toward the cabin with guns drawn. He fired twice. The first shot caught one man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second missed, but made the other man dive behind the well for cover. "Gideon!" Naeli's voice from inside. "They're rushing!" He spun, ran back inside. Through the front window, he could see 3 riders charging the cabin at full gallop, screaming like demons firing as they came. It was insane, suicidal, and absolutely terrifying. Nayeli fired. One rider jerked and fell from his saddle, hitting the ground hard. She levered another round, fired again. Miss! The riders were too close now, too fast. Gideon grabbed the dynamite. He'd handled explosives exactly twice in his life, both times mining for gold that wasn't there. His hands shook as he cut a length of fuse too short, too long, and crimped a cap onto the dynamite stick. He struck a match on his boot, held it to the fuse. It caught with a spark and hiss. "Get down!" he shouted at Nayeli and threw the dynamite out the window. It tumbled through the air, fuse burning bright, and landed directly in the path of the charging riders. Time seemed to slow. Gideon saw their eyes go wide, saw them try to rein in their horses. Too late, too fast, too close. The explosion was tremendous, a physical force that shook the cabin's walls and blew out what was left of the windows. Fire and earth erupted in a column that reached for the darkening sky. The shockwave hit Gideon like a giant's hand, throwing him backward into the wall, hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. When the dust cleared, 2 horses were down and screaming. One rider lay motionless. Another crawled away from the crater, his clothes smoking. The third rider was nowhere to be seen, either thrown clear or erased entirely. Through the ringing in his ears, Gideon heard Knox shouting orders. The gunfire had stopped. In its place came the sound of hoofbeats, but these were different. Distant. Multiple. Lots of them. Nayeli appeared beside him. Her face smudged with powder smoke, blood running from a cut on her cheek where flying wood had caught her. But she was smiling, fierce and wild, and absolutely terrifying. "Listen," she said. Gideon listened. The hoofbeats were getting closer, coming from the north, from the mountains, from Apache territory. And then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold and hot at the same time. A war horn, long and low and full of rage that had been building for months, for years, for generations. Through the darkness came riders, dozens of them, hundreds maybe. Apache warriors painted for battle, carrying rifles and bows and lances that gleamed in the moonlight that had risen while Gideon wasn't paying attention. Leading them was an older man on a paint horse, his face lined with age and anger, wearing the bearing of someone who'd commanded men through more fights than Gideon could imagine. "White Hawk," Nayeli breathed. "My grandfather." Knox saw them too. Through the shattered window, Gideon watched the man's confident cruelty crack into something that might have been fear. His remaining men, 3-4, were already wheeling their horses, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. "Retreat," Knox shouted. "Fall back to—" But there was nowhere to fall back to. The Apache riders were everywhere, surrounding the cabin and the burned area, cutting off every avenue of escape. They didn't charge, didn't attack, just circled silent and deadly like wolves, watching deer realize they were already dead. Chief Whitehawk rode forward alone. He was maybe 60, maybe 70, with gray hair worn long and eyes that had seen everything the world could do and remained unimpressed. He carried a rifle across his saddle, but his hands were empty of weapons as he stopped 20 feet from where Knox sat on his horse. When he spoke, his voice carried easily accented but clear. "Fletcher Knox, the governor's mad dog. My granddaughter warned me about you." Knox had recovered some of his composure. His hand remained on his pistol, but he didn't draw. "Chief Whitehawk, this is territorial business, federal business. You're interfering with murder," Whitehawk interrupted, "with hanging my granddaughter from a gate like she was an animal, with burning good men alive for knowing the truth." He shook his head slowly. "No. You are the one interfering. For months I have held my warriors back, watched your governor steal our land, listened to his judges declare our treaties void, allowed your politicians to grow fat on our suffering." He paused. "But you touched my family, and now you will learn why we were never truly conquered, only patient." Gideon realized he was still holding the Colt. His hand ached from gripping it too hard. Beside him, Nayeli moved toward the door. "You should not go out there," he said. "He is my grandfather," she replied. "And this is our fight." She walked out into the night, and Gideon, because he was apparently committed to making terrible decisions, followed. The scene that greeted them was surreal. Knox and his 3 surviving men sat their horses like criminals awaiting sentencing, surrounded by a ring of Apache warriors who hadn't moved or made a sound but radiated violence held on a trembling leash. The two men Gideon had wounded at the back door lay face down in the dirt, hands on their heads, guarded by warriors who looked disappointed they hadn't resisted. Whitehawk's eyes found Naeli. Something passed between them. Recognition, relief, love. Rage, all of it contained and controlled. When he spoke, it was in Apache, rapid and fluid. Naeli answered, gesturing toward the cabin, toward Gideon, toward Knox. Then Whitehawk's gaze turned to Gideon himself, and suddenly Gideon understood how a rabbit felt when the hawk's shadow passed overhead. "You are the man who bought this land," Whitehawk said. "It wasn't a question." "For 12 cents, Gideon confirmed. "Seemed like a good deal at the time." The ghost of what might have been amusement touched the old chief's face. "And you cut my granddaughter down. Why?" It was the same question Naeli had asked. Gideon gave the same answer. "Because leaving her there wasn't an option." Whitehawk studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, as if Gideon had passed some test he didn't know he was taking. "The documents," Whitehawk said. "Naeli tells me you found them." "Inside," Gideon said. "Hartwell hid them in the fireplace. Deeds, letters, proof of everything Webb and Crane have done." "Will you give them to me?" It was a reasonable question. They were Apache lands being stolen, Apache people being harmed. The documents should go to Whitehawk. "Except no," Gideon said. Every warrior within earshot tensed, rifles shifted. Whitehawk's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Explain," the chief said. "Because if you take them, you become an enemy of the territorial government," Gideon said. "They'll call it theft. Say you killed their men." He gestured at Knox and stole legal documents. "They'll use it as an excuse to send the army, and when the army comes, people die. Your people." "And what do you suggest?" Whitehawk asked. "We deliver them together," Gideon said, "to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. You, me, Naeli, and anyone else you want to bring. We make it official, legal, public. Force them to acknowledge what Webb and Crane have done. Then it's not an Apache uprising, it's justice." Whitehawk considered this. Behind him, Knox made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You stupid son of the federal marshal is Webb's brother-in-law. You think you'll get justice from him?" "Maybe not," Gideon admitted. "But I think we'll get attention, and attention is what Webb can't afford. Once word gets out, once newspapers start asking questions, once other tribes hear there's proof." He shrugged. "Hard to keep a conspiracy secret when everyone's looking at it." Whitehawk looked at his granddaughter. She nodded. Then he looked back at Gideon, and when he spoke there was something new in his voice. Respect maybe, or the beginning of it. "You risk much for land you have owned for hours," he said. "I risk much for land I intend to keep," Gideon corrected. "This is my home now, and I don't want it built on stolen ground." The old chief smiled a real smile this time, full of teeth and something that might have been approval. "Then we will ride to Santa Fe together. The white man who paid 12 cents for truth and the Apache who refused to die quietly." He turned to his warriors, speaking in his own language. They responded with raised weapons and voices that turned into a chorus of agreement. Then Whitehawk looked at Knox. The smile disappeared. "You," he said, "will come too, as proof of what the governor does in shadow." "Like hell," Knox said. His hand moved toward his pistol. He was fast. Gideon had to give him that. The silver-handled revolver cleared leather in a blur of motion that spoke to hundreds of draws, thousands of hours of practice. But Naeli was faster. The Winchester boomed once. Knox's hat, that silver-white hat that had gleamed in the sun, flew off his head, torn by the bullet that should have gone through his skull, but instead just left a bleeding crease across his scalp. He froze, gun half raised, as blood ran down his face. "The next one goes lower," Naeli said calmly, levering another round into the chamber. Knox looked at her, at Whitehawk, at the ring of warriors, at Gideon standing with the Colt still in his hand. Whatever calculation went through his mind, he apparently didn't like the math. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his pistol. "Smart," Whitehawk said. Then to his warriors, "Bind them. All of them. We leave at dawn." The warriors moved in, stripping Knox and his men of weapons, tying their hands. It was efficient, practiced the kind of thing you did when you'd taken prisoners before. Knox submitted to it with a face like stone, but his eyes promised murder and suffering and vengeance that would make this night look like a church social. Gideon didn't care. He was too tired, too wrung out, too aware that he'd somehow survived the last 3 hours, when by all rights he should be dead. "Come," Whitehawk said to him. "My people will make camp. We have food medicine. Nayeli needs treatment, and you—" He looked Gideon up and down. "You look like a man who fought a war in an afternoon." "Feels like it," Gideon admitted. They walked back toward the cabin. Behind them, Apache warriors began setting up what looked like a temporary village, fires being lit, horses being tended, prisoners being watched. The prairie that had been empty except for death hours before was now full of life and purpose, and the kind of controlled chaos that came from people who knew exactly what they were doing. Inside the cabin, the documents still lay scattered on the table. Gideon gathered them carefully, returning them to their leather folder, wrapping that in the oilskin. Samuel Hartwell had died protecting these papers. The least Gideon could do was keep them safe for the journey ahead. Nayeli appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the fires outside. Her injuries looked worse. In the better light, the rope burns, the cut on her face, bruises darkening her arms and shoulders. But she stood straight, unbowed, and when she looked at Gideon, there was something in her expression he couldn't quite read. "You could have kept your head down," she said, "given me to Knox, taken his money, and lived quietly." "Could have," Gideon agreed. "Why didn't you—" It was the third time someone had asked him why. Maybe the universe was trying to make him examine his motivations. Gideon looked down at the documents in his hands, proof of theft and murder and corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial power. He thought about Samuel Hartwell burning alive in the barn, about Nayeli hanging from the gate, about 12 cents and a land deal that had seemed too good to be true because it absolutely was. "Because," he said, finally meeting her eyes, "a man's got to stand for something, and if I can't stand for what's right when it costs me everything, then what the hell is the point of standing at all?" Nayeli studied him for a long moment. Then she crossed the room and did something that surprised him. She placed one massive hand on his shoulder, squeezed once, and spoke in Apache. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. "Thank you." "We ride at dawn," she said, switching back to English. "Santa Fe is 5 days south. We will be hunted every mile of the way. Webb will send men. Crane will send men. Every bounty hunter and outlaw between here and Mexico will hear there's money on our heads." She paused. "You can still walk away. Take your 12 cents worth of dirt and disappear." Gideon looked around the cabin at the bullet holes in the walls, at the bloodstains on the floor, at the evidence of violence that had marked this place long before he arrived. Then he looked at the documents, at the proof that could change everything. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "This is my land, paid for it fair and square." He smiled, tired and genuine. "Besides, I've got a feeling things are about to get interesting." Outside, someone began to sing a low, rhythmic Apache chant that other voices picked up until it filled the night like a promise or a prayer or a declaration of war. The fires burned bright, the stars wheeled overhead, and Gideon Hale, owner of the 12-cent cabin and accidental witness to conspiracy, sat down at Samuel Hartwell's table and prepared for whatever dawn would bring. He'd bought land for pocket change and found a war. He'd saved a woman's life and made enemies of the territory's most powerful men. He'd discovered proof of crimes that would shake the foundations of everything the government claimed to stand for. And somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. For now. But dawn was coming, and with it would come the real test, not of whether one broke rancher and one Apache warrior could survive the night, but whether they could survive the journey ahead. 5 days to Santa Fe. 5 days being hunted. 5 days to deliver justice or die trying. Gideon cleaned the Colt, reloaded it, and set it on the table within easy reach. Through the window, he could see Whitehawk moving among his warriors, speaking quietly, organizing, planning. The old chief knew what was coming. They all did. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was only just beginning. And as Gideon finally allowed himself to close his eyes, for a moment he thought about 12 cents, about how such a small amount of money could buy so much trouble, so much danger, so much responsibility, but also maybe so much purpose. He'd been drifting for months, a ghost of what he used to be. Now he had land. He had a cause. He had allies who'd fight beside him and enemies who'd stop at nothing to silence him. He had a reason to keep living. Outside, the singing continued. Inside, Naeli stood guard. At the window, the Winchester cradled in her arms, watching the darkness for threats that would surely come. And Gideon Hale, exhausted and terrified, and somehow more alive than he'd been in years, let the sounds of the Apache camp lull him toward something that might have been rest. Tomorrow they would ride. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, he would sleep in his own cabin on his own land, purchased for 12 cents and worth more than he could ever repay. The legend of the 12-cent cabin was being written in blood and fire, and Gideon Hale was holding the pen. Dawn came cold and painted the sky the color of old bruises. Gideon woke to the sound of horses being readied and men speaking in low voices that carried the particular tension of people preparing for danger. His back ached from sleeping against the cabin wall, his hand still wrapped around the Colt like it was the only solid thing in the world. Through the broken window, he could see Apache warriors breaking camp with the efficiency of long practice, erasing evidence of their presence as if they'd never been there at all. Naeli stood where she'd been all night, still watching, still armed. In the gray light, she looked less like a woman and more like something carved from stone and fury, something that wouldn't break no matter what the world threw at it. "You didn't sleep," Gideon said, his voice rough. "Sleep is a luxury," she replied without turning. "Vigilance is survival." Whitehawk appeared in the doorway, bringing with him the smell of smoke and coffee that made Gideon's stomach remind him he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The old chief looked like he'd slept well, which probably meant he hadn't slept at all, but was better at hiding it. "We leave in 20 minutes, Whitehawk said. "My scouts report riders coming from Liberty. 10 men, maybe 12. They're 2 hours behind us if we move now." "Webb's reinforcements," Gideon said, pushing himself to his feet. Everything hurt. "That was fast." "Knox would have sent word before he rode out yesterday," Whitehawk explained. "Told them if he did not return by dawn, send more men. Standard procedure for a man who makes enemies professionally." He paused, studying Gideon with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Can you ride?" "I can do what I must," Gideon said, echoing Naeli's words from yesterday. It earned him a flicker of approval from both of them. "Good. We have horses for you and Naeli. Food for the journey. And—" Whitehawk gestured outside where several warriors were loading something onto a travois. "You're prisoners. Knox and his men will slow us down, but we need them as evidence. Dead men tell no tales, but captured dogs can be made to bark." They stepped outside into chaos that looked like order. Dozens of warriors moved with purpose, packing gear, checking weapons, mounting horses. Knox and his 3 surviving men sat bound and gagged near the remnants of last night's fire, watched by young warriors who looked eager for any excuse to do violence. Knox's face was crusted with dried blood from where Naeli's bullet had creased his skull, and his eyes followed Gideon with the kind of hate that outlasted empires. A warrior brought 2 horses forward, a sturdy roan for Gideon, and a massive gray mare for Naeli that looked like the only horse in the territory that could comfortably carry her frame. Both animals were saddled with Apache-style tack lighter than what Gideon was used to, but clearly functional. "I can't pay you for these," Gideon said to Whitehawk. The old chief smiled. "You already paid, with 12 cents and courage. That buys more than horses in my economy." Naeli swung onto her mare with practiced ease despite her injuries. Gideon climbed onto the roan more carefully, his body protesting every movement. When was the last time he'd ridden? Months. His legs remembered before his mind did, muscle memory taking over. Whitehawk mounted his paint horse and raised one hand. The camp fell instantly silent. 40 warriors, maybe 50, all watching their chief with absolute attention. "We ride to Santa Fe," Whitehawk called out in Apache, then switched to English for Gideon's benefit. "We carry proof of crimes against our people. We will be hunted. Some of us may die. But we ride for justice, for truth, for the future of our children and their children. We ride so the world will know what was done to us, and so those who did it will face judgment." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "We ride as warriors. We ride as witnesses. We ride together." The warriors responded with a sound that wasn't quite a cheer, wasn't quite a war cry, but something in between acknowledgement and acceptance and readiness, all wrapped into one fierce note. Then they moved. The column formed quickly with scouts ranging ahead, and to the flanks the main body in the center and a rear guard watching their back trail. Knox and his men were loaded onto the travois, dragged behind horses like cargo. Gideon found himself riding near the front beside Naeli, with Whitehawk just ahead, setting a pace that ate up ground without exhausting the horses. They rode south and east, avoiding the main road to Liberty, cutting across open prairie where the grass stood tall enough to brush their stirrups. The sun climbed higher, turning the cold dawn into merely cool morning, and Gideon felt himself settling into the rhythm of the ride, the creak of leather, the breathing of the horse, the vast emptiness of land that stretched to horizons so distant they looked like the edge of forever. "Tell me about Santa Fe," Naeli said after an hour of silence. She rode like she'd been born in the saddle, her massive frame balanced perfectly, the Winchester in a scabbard at her knee. "Never been," Gideon admitted. "No, it's the territorial capital, federal marshal's office there. Bigger than Liberty by a considerable amount." "Will we be believed?" It was the question that had been gnawing at Gideon since last night. "Don't know. Webb's got reach, money, influence, and like Knox said, the marshal's connected to him by marriage." He shifted in the saddle, the oilskin package with Hartwell's documents secured in his saddlebag like a ticking bomb. "But we've got proof. Real documented proof. That's got to count for something." "White men's courts do not always value truth over power," Naeli said quietly. She wasn't wrong. Gideon had seen enough of the world to know that justice and law were cousins, at best strangers more often. But what else could they do? Hide in the mountains, live as fugitives. Let Webb and Crane continue stealing land and destroying lives. "Your grandfather seems to think this'll work," Gideon said. "My grandfather thinks this is the best of bad options," Naeli corrected. The worst option was war-open conflict that would bring the army down on every Apache from here to Mexico. This way, if we fail, at least we fail publicly. The world will see that we tried to use white man's justice before we were forced to use our own. That was a sobering thought. They weren't just writing to deliver documents. They were writing to prove a point, to establish justification for whatever came next. If this didn't work, if Webb walked away clean, the Apache would have their excuse for war, and thousands would die. No pressure. They rode through morning into afternoon, stopping twice to rest the horses and once to eat jerky and hard bread that tasted like saddle leather but filled the hole in Gideon's stomach. The scouts reported no pursuit yet, but everyone knew it was coming. Webb wouldn't let them reach Santa Fe unchallenged. As the sun peaked and started its descent, they entered rougher country-low hills covered in scrub brush and scattered pine with rocky outcroppings that provided cover but also perfect ambush positions. Whitehawk slowed the pace, sending more scouts ahead, tightening the formation. "This is where they will hit us," he told Gideon during a brief stop. "If I were hunting us, I would strike here where the terrain limits our movement and provides concealment." "How long until we're through it?" Gideon asked. 2 hours to reach the canyon pass. Another hour through the pass itself. After that, open ground again until nightfall. The old chief studied the hills ahead with eyes that had navigated this country for 6 decades. "We should reach it before they can organize an ambush. Should." They pushed on. The land rose and fell, channeling them into a natural path that followed a dry stream bed between hills that grew steeper and closer with each mile. Gideon felt exposed, like being in the bottom of a bowl with riflemen on the rim. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every bird taking flight from the brush might have been spooked by hidden gunmen. The column had stretched out scouts far ahead now, the main body moving single file through terrain that didn't allow for width. Gideon rode behind Naeli, watching her scan the hillsides with the Winchester across her saddle. Behind him came a dozen warriors, then the travois with the prisoners, then more warriors, then the rear guard somewhere back in the dust. They were vulnerable. Everyone knew it. But the alternative was to detour days out of their way, and time was a luxury they didn't have. The first shot came without warning. One moment, there was just the sound of hooves on stone and leather creaking and men breathing. The next, a rifle cracked from the left hillside, and one of the forward scouts jerked in his saddle, blood spraying from his shoulder. He didn't fall, managed to wheel his horse and gallop back toward the column, but the damage was done. The ambush had been sprung. "Cover! Oh!" Whitehawk roared, but there wasn't any. They were in a kill box exposed with riflemen on both sides of the stream bed, now opening fire in a ragged volley that turned the air into a storm of lead and death. A horse screamed and went down, throwing its rider. A warrior behind Gideon took a bullet in the leg and bit back a cry of pain, but stayed mounted. The column fragmented instantly. Warriors scattering to whatever meager cover they could find. Boulders, slight depressions in the ground, the bodies of fallen horses. Gideon threw himself from the saddle as bullets whined past his head. He hit the ground hard. Rolled came up behind a rock that wouldn't stop a determined grasshopper, but was better than nothing. The Colt was in his hand, though he didn't remember drawing it. 20 yards ahead, Naeli had dismounted and taken position behind a larger boulder, the Winchester already speaking its deadly language toward the left hillside. "How many?" Gideon shouted. "Too many, Colt," came the reply. He risked a look. The hillsides were dotted with muzzle flashes, 15, 20, maybe more. Professional ambush, well-positioned, good fields of fire. This wasn't some hasty pursuit from Liberty. This was planned, coordinated, executed by men who knew what they were doing, which meant Webb had gotten word ahead of them somehow. A bullet spanged off the rock near Gideon's head, showering him with stone chips. He fired back blindly, knowing he probably wouldn't hit anything, but hoping to make the shooters think twice about showing themselves. The Colt's cylinder emptied fast, 6 shots gone in seconds, and he fumbled for cartridges to reload with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear. Around him, Apache warriors returned fire with disciplined precision. These weren't fighters caught by surprise. They'd been in ambushes before, probably set a few themselves. They found cover, established fields of fire, started working as units without needing orders. Gideon saw one warrior laying down suppressing fire, while 2 others moved to better positions. Saw another helping the wounded scout to safety while maintaining his own weapon discipline. But they were still pinned, still taking casualties, still losing. Whitehawk appeared beside Gideon, moving in a crouch that belied his age. "We must break the ambush or die here. See the outcropping." He pointed to a position on the right hillside where muzzle flashes were concentrated. "That is their anchor. Take it out. Their line collapses." "How?" Gideon asked. It was 100 yards of open ground to the base of that hill, then 50 more straight up. "Suicide." "We do not go straight," Whitehawk said. He turned and called orders in Apache. 5 warriors immediately detached from the main group, moving low and fast to the left, away from the objective. Gideon watched, confused, until he understood. They were flanking. Using the terrain the ambushers thought was protecting them, circling around to hit the right hillside from an angle the shooters wouldn't expect. "How long?" Gideon asked. 10 minutes if they are fast. Forever if they are dead." Whitehawk raised his voice. Everyone concentrated fire on the right hillside. Make them keep their heads down. What followed was the loudest, most sustained volley Gideon had ever heard. 40 warriors firing in coordinated waves, the sound rolling like continuous thunder bullets, chewing into stone and brush, and hopefully flesh on that hillside. It was suppression fire meant to blind and confuse, to make the ambushers worry about dying instead of killing. Gideon added the Colt's voice to the chorus, firing and reloading until the gun was too hot to hold comfortably, and his ears rang with a sound that might have been permanent. Beside him, Naeli worked the Winchester like a machine, each shot deliberate, pausing only to reload from the cartridge box at her belt. Minutes crawled past. A warrior took a round through the throat and went down choking. Another lost 2 fingers to a near miss that sparked off his rifle barrel. The wounded were dragged to whatever safety existed, which wasn't much. Then from the right hillside, new sounds, screaming, confused shouts. The ambushers' fire slackened as they suddenly had threats from 2 directions. Whitehawk's flanking team had reached their position and was hitting the outcropping from behind. "Now!" Whitehawk roared. "Forward, everyone, forward!" It went against every instinct Gideon had. Charging into gunfire was how you died fast. But the old chief was already moving, running in a crouch toward the hills, and his warriors followed without hesitation. Gideon found himself running too. The Colt empty but still in his hand like a talisman, his legs pumping his heart trying to beat out of his chest. They covered the distance in seconds that felt like hours. Bullets sang past. A man fell beside Gideon, face gone dead before he hit ground. Another took a round in the gut, but kept running, driven by momentum and dying fury. Then they hit the hillside, and everything became chaos at close quarters. Ambushers who'd been safe behind cover suddenly had Apache warriors on top of them, and distance advantage became a death sentence. Gideon saw a man try to swing his rifle around, saw Nayeli's war club. Where had she gotten a war club crush his skull before he could complete the motion? Saw White Hawk moving like a ghost knife, flashing two men down before they knew he was there. Gideon slammed into an ambusher who was frantically trying to reload. They went down in a tangle of limbs rolling in the dirt and rocks. The man got a hand around Gideon's throat, squeezing, face twisted with effort and fear. Gideon still had the Colt. He swung it like a club, felt it connect with bone, swung again. The grip on his throat loosened. Third time the man went limp. He pushed the body off, gasping, and looked around. The right hillside was secured, 6 ambushers dead, 3 running, the rest surrendered or too wounded to fight. The left hillside was breaking too, shooters fleeing now that their position had collapsed. "Let them run," White Hawk called out. "We need speed more than bodies." The warriors didn't pursue. They gathered their wounded, 4 dead, 7 injured, badly enough to need immediate attention, and regrouped in the stream bed while the ambushers' retreat became a rout. Within 5 minutes, the hills were silent, except for the moaning of the wounded and the nervous sounds of horses. Gideon leaned against a boulder, breathing hard, trying to process the fact that he was still alive. His hands were shaking. The Colt had blood on it, the ambusher's blood sticky and dark. He felt sick. Nayeli appeared, checking him for wounds with impersonal efficiency. "You are hit." "Don't think so." Gideon managed. "You." "No." She had blood on her too, but none of it seemed to be hers. The war club hanging from her belt was crusted with things Gideon didn't want to look at too closely. "You fought well. For a rancher." "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was not intended as one," she said, but something in her eyes suggested otherwise. "Come, we must move before they regroup." The column reformed quickly, though it was smaller now and bloodied. The wounded were loaded onto horses, the dead wrapped in blankets, and secured to spare mounts. They would be buried properly later when there was time. The prisoners on the travois had survived the ambush unharmed, protected by the warriors assigned to guard them. Knox watched everything with eyes that calculated and measured and filed away information for future use. They pushed through the canyon pass at a faster pace, knowing the ambush meant Webb knew their route and their timing. The element of surprise was gone. Now, it was a race. Could they reach Santa Fe before Webb marshaled enough force to stop them permanently? As the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, they emerged from the rough country into rolling plains that stretched endlessly south. In the distance, barely visible in the gathering dusk, Gideon could see smoke from settlements, signs of civilization, signs that they were getting closer, but also signs that Webb's reach extended everywhere they were going. They made camp that night in a defensible position, a ring of rocks on a low hill that provided clear sight lines in all directions. No fires despite the cold, no noise beyond what was necessary. Sentries posted in 3 rings rotating every 2 hours. Everyone slept with weapons in hand. Gideon found himself unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went bone deep. He sat with his back against a rock, the Colt cleaned and reloaded in his lap, staring at stars that looked like they'd been scattered by a careless hand. "You are thinking too loud," Nayeli said from nearby. She'd positioned herself close to him, close enough to respond if trouble came far enough to maintain propriety. "I can hear your thoughts from here." "How do you know I'm thinking?" Gideon asked. "Because you are not snoring like the others, and you are staring at nothing with eyes that see everything." She shifted position, and in the starlight, he could see her profile strong, fierce, somehow more human than the fury she'd been in combat. "What troubles you, Koptais?" "Everything, what?" Gideon admitted. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, being hunted by people with unlimited resources. We're carrying documents that could start a war. We're taking prisoners to face justice in a system that's probably already decided to let them walk. And He stopped. She prompted. I paid 12 cents for land and somehow ended up responsible for whether thousands of people live or die. He finished quietly. Doesn't seem like a fair trade. Nayeli was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, My grandfather tells a story. When he was young, before the white men came, in Numbers he found a wolf caught in a trap. The wolf was fierce, dangerous, would surely bite him if he freed it. But it was also dying, and my grandfather could not leave it to suffer. So he freed the wolf, expecting to be attacked. Instead, the wolf looked at him, understood what he had done, and left. She paused. 3 winters later, my grandfather was hunting alone when a bear attacked. He would have died, but a wolf came from nowhere and fought the bear, giving my grandfather time to escape. It was the same wolf. He knew by the scar on its leg from the trap. What's the moral? Gideon asked. That sometimes you do not choose your path. Sometimes your path chooses you because of who you are, not what you want. You could have ridden past my body on that gate, but you did not because you are the kind of man who cannot leave suffering unhealed. That is not weakness. That is strength. And it is why my grandfather trusts you, why I trust you, why 40 warriors follow you into danger. She looked at him directly. You paid 12 cents for land, but you paid with your character for everything that followed. Gideon absorbed that. It didn't make him feel less terrified or less overwhelmed, but it helped somehow. Made the weight feel less like a burden and more like a responsibility he could maybe possibly carry. Thank you, he said. Do not thank me yet, Nayeli replied. We have 4 more days to Santa Fe. Much can happen in 4 days. She wasn't wrong. They rode out before dawn, pushing the horses harder now, knowing speed was their only advantage. The landscape changed as they traveled prairie, giving way to more settled country farms, appearing in the distance roads that saw regular traffic. Signs of the territory growing, expanding, consuming the land that had been Apache for generations. The second attack came at midday. This time there was no ambush, no attempt at surprise, just 6 riders coming hard from the east, clearly visible across the open ground, making no effort to hide their intent. They wore no uniforms, carried no badges, but Gideon recognized the type-hired guns, professional killers, the kind of men Webb would pay to do what his own people couldn't. Bounty hunters, Durs, Whitehawk said, watching them approach. Word has spread. There will be money on our heads now, significant money. How do you want to handle it? Gideon asked. The old chief smiled, not a pleasant expression. We show them the cost of Webb's gold. He called orders. 20 warriors broke from the column and formed a line facing the oncoming riders. They didn't take cover, didn't dismount, just sat their horses in a formation that said clearly, Come and die. The bounty hunters came anyway. Maybe they thought Apache warriors were exaggerated legends. Maybe they thought 6 guns against 20 were good enough odds if you were fast and lucky. Maybe they were just stupid. Gideon watched from the column as the distance closed 400 yards, 300, 200. The warriors didn't move, didn't raise weapons, just waited with the patience of stones. At 100 yards, Whitehawk raised his hand. At 50 yards, he dropped it. The line of warriors exploded into motion. Not charging forward, breaking into a wheel formation, each rider moving in a complex pattern Gideon couldn't follow. The bounty hunters fired, but they were shooting at targets that were suddenly everywhere and nowhere, circling, tightening, moving too fast to track. It was over in 30 seconds. 5 bounty hunters on the ground, dead or dying. The 6th turned his horse and ran, making it maybe 200 yards before an arrow took him in the back and dropped him from the saddle. The warriors reformed their line, not a single one of them injured, and rode back to the column like they'd just completed a routine drill. Jesus, Gideon breathed. Now the word will spread differently, Whitehawk said with satisfaction. Now they will know we are not easy prey. The price Webb offers must be balanced against the price they will pay to collect it. But the attacks didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. That evening, 8 more riders tried a running assault and died for it. In the night, someone attempted to stampede their horses, failed when sentries killed 2 saboteurs and drove off the rest. The next morning brought a long-range sniper who managed to wound a warrior before being hunted down and killed. Webb was throwing everything he had at them, and everything wasn't enough, but it was slowing them down, wearing them down, taking a toll measured in blood and exhaustion and constant vigilance that ground men to dust. By the third day, they'd lost 11 warriors dead and 16 wounded badly enough that they couldn't fight effectively. The horses were exhausted, ammunition was running low, and Santa Fe was still 2 days distant. They camped that night in an abandoned homestead, a burned-out ruin that provided some shelter and clear fields of fire. Gideon sat cleaning the Colt for the 100th time, his hands doing the work while his mind wandered. "We might not make it," he said to no one in particular. White Hawk, sitting nearby working on his rifle, didn't look up. "We will make it, or we will not. Worry does not change the outcome." That's not very comforting. It was not meant to be comforting. It was meant to be true. Now the old chief did look up, and his eyes held something Gideon recognized. Determination that outlasted hope. "We carry truth. That is a weapon stronger than any gun, more dangerous than any army. Webb knows this. That is why he fights so hard to stop us. That is why we must continue no matter the cost. And if we all die before we reach Santa Fe, then we die for something worth dying for," White Hawk said simply. "Better than dying for nothing in your bed when you are too old to remember why you lived." Naeli joined them, moving with the slight stiffness that came from days in the saddle and injuries that hadn't fully healed. She carried coffee, somehow real coffee, not the substitute they'd been drinking, and 3 tin cups. "Where did you get this?" Gideon asked, accepting a cup gratefully. "Took it from one of the bounty hunters," she said. "The dead have no use for coffee." They drank in silence, watching the sunset paint the ruins gold and red. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes howled. Closer horses nickered softly to each other. The smell of sage and dust and old smoke filled the air. "Tomorrow we cross into settled territory," White Hawk said. "More towns, more witnesses. Webb will not be able to attack us openly there without risking exposure." "Will he risk it anyway?" Gideon asked. "I do not know. We are forcing him to choose between letting us reach Santa Fe with our proof or committing acts so brazen they prove our accusations." The old chief smiled grimly. "Either way, he loses. The question is how many of us he takes with him." That night, Gideon managed a few hours of fitful sleep dreams full of gunfire and blood and gates with bodies hanging from them. He woke before dawn to find Naeli standing guard still as a statue, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the ruins. "Any movement?" he asked quietly. "Nothing," she said. "But they are out there, watching, waiting, planning." She glanced at him. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better," Gideon admitted. "I've been worse too, but I can't remember when." "You have done well," Naeli said. "Most white men would have broken by now, ridden away in the night, or surrendered, or simply collapsed from the weight of it all. But you are still here." "Don't have anywhere else to be," Gideon said. "You could be on your 12-cent land, building a life, staying safe." She turned to face him fully. "Why do you continue the truth now, not the heroic answer you give others?" Gideon thought about it, really thought about it. Why was he still here when every rational bone in his body screamed that he should run? "Because I was dead before this," he said finally. "Not actually dead, but not really alive either, just existing, drifting. Then I bought that cabin and found you, and suddenly I had a purpose again. Something worth doing, something worth fighting for." He met her eyes. "I'd rather die trying to do something right than live doing nothing at all." Naeli studied him for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead briefly against his, a gesture of respect or affection or recognition. When she pulled back, her expression had softened. "You would have made a good Apache," she said. It was the finest compliment Gideon had ever received. They rode out at first light, and by noon they saw the first real town, not Liberty, with its dusty street and frontier desperation, but a proper settlement with brick buildings and multiple streets, and the kind of bustle that came from commerce and civilization. People stopped to stare as the column rode through Apache warriors in war paint, prisoners bound on travois, a white rancher riding among them like he belonged. Word would spread from here. By tomorrow, everyone in the territory would know they were coming. Whitehawk led them through the town without stopping, ignoring the stares and the whispered conversations and the hasty retreat of citizens who wanted no part of whatever was happening. They followed the main road south, and when they camped that night, it was within sight of another settlement's lights. "One more day," Whitehawk said that evening. "By tomorrow night we will be in Santa Fe. Either we will deliver our evidence to the marshal or we will die trying. There is no third option now." No one disagreed. The fourth day's ride was the longest and shortest of Gideon's life. Longest because every mile seemed to take hours, because the tension was so thick you could choke on it, because everyone knew the final confrontation was coming, and not knowing when was worse than facing it. Shortest because suddenly they crested a rise, and there it was. Santa Fe spread out below them, larger and more established than any place Gideon had ever seen a city that actually deserved the name, with church spires and government buildings and streets that ran in organized grids. Somewhere down there was the marshal's office. Somewhere down there was justice, or the pretense of it. Somewhere down there, Webb's influence reached its fingers, but maybe possibly couldn't close its fist completely. "We ride in together," Whitehawk said. "All of us. Make it impossible for them to ignore us or disappear us quietly. We will be seen, we will be heard, and we will make them choose publicly whether they stand for law or for corruption." They descended toward Santa Fe and formation warriors flanking the prisoners Gideon and Naeli, riding at Whitehawk's side. The sun was setting behind them, casting their shadows long across the road, and Gideon thought about how much had changed since he'd paid 12 cents for a cursed cabin 5 days ago. He'd been nobody then. A broken rancher with nothing to lose. He was still nobody, really. Still broke. Still just a man with a gun and a horse and documents he barely understood. But he was nobody riding towards something that mattered and that made all the difference in the world. The streets of Santa Fe went silent as they rode through. Not the peaceful silence of evening settling in, but the held-breath silence of people witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Women pulled children inside. Merchants stepped back from their storefronts. Even the dogs seemed to understand that something significant was happening and kept their distance. 40 Apache warriors riding in formation through the territorial capital, prisoners in tow, heading straight for the government plaza. It was the kind of thing that started wars or ended them, and everyone watching knew it. Gideon kept his hand near the Colt, but not on it trying to look confident, despite the fact that his stomach was doing complicated acrobatics. Buildings rose on either side, 2 stories, 3 stories, some made of adobe in the old style, but others of brick and timber that spoke to American ambition and expansion. Gas lamps were being lit against the coming darkness, casting yellow pools of light that made the shadows between them seem deeper and more threatening. "The plaza is ahead," Whitehawk said quietly. "The marshal's office faces it beside the courthouse. We will ride directly there and present ourselves formally in front of witnesses. They cannot make us disappear if hundreds have seen us arrive." "They can try," Naeli said. "Yes," Whitehawk agreed. "They can try." They emerged into the plaza, and Gideon's breath caught. It was massive, a square, maybe 200 feet on each side, surrounded by buildings that housed the machinery of territorial government. The courthouse dominated the north side, 3 stories of stone and ambition, with columns that tried to invoke ancient Rome and mostly succeeded in looking presumptuous. The marshal's office sat beside it, smaller but more practical, with bars on the windows and a gallows visible in the yard behind it. And everywhere, people. The plaza was crowded with citizens taking the evening air, conducting business, socializing. Maybe 200 souls, all of whom turned to stare as the Apache column entered the square. The effect was instantaneous. Some people ran. Others pressed back against buildings, making themselves small. A few reached for weapons they probably didn't know how to use, but most just stared, transfixed by the sight of something their nightmares had warned them about, but they'd never expected to actually see. Whitehawk rode to the center of the plaza and stopped. His warriors formed a circle around him, around Gideon and Naeli, around the prisoners. It was a statement: "We are here, we are strong, we will not be moved." "I am Whitehawk," the old chief called out, in English, his voice carrying across the plaza with the force of absolute authority. "Chief of the Mescalero Apache. I come under flag of truce to present evidence of crimes against my people to the federal marshal. I come in peace, but I come prepared for war. I ask for justice. I demand to be heard." For a moment, nothing happened. The plaza remained frozen, a tableau of tension and uncertainty. Then the door to the marshal's office opened, and a man stepped out. He was maybe 50, with a beard gone mostly gray and a gut that suggested he'd spent more time behind a desk than on a horse in recent years. He wore a tin star on his vest and an expression that said he really didn't want to be dealing with this right now. Behind him, two deputies appeared, younger men with nervous eyes and hands that hovered near their weapons. "I'm Marshal Garrett," the man said. His voice was steady, which suggested either courage or stupidity. "You're causing a disturbance, Chief. This is American territory, and this is Apache territory." White Hawk interrupted. "Stolen through fraud, forgery, and murder, and we have proof." He gestured toward Gideon. "This man will present the evidence. You will examine it. Then you will decide whether you serve justice or corruption." Garrett's eyes found Gideon, and recognition flickered across his face. Not personal recognition. Gideon doubted the marshal had ever seen him before, but the recognition of type. White man, poor, probably nobody important. The kind of person who shouldn't be riding with Apache warriors into a territorial capital. "Who are you?" Garrett asked. "Gideon Hale." Gideon said, surprised. His voice came out steady. "I own land near Liberty. Bought it 5 days ago for 12 cents. Found some things hidden there. Things people have been killing to keep secret." "What kind of things?" Gideon dismounted, acutely aware that hundreds of eyes were watching him, that one wrong move could turn this whole situation into a massacre. He walked to his saddlebag, retrieved the oilskin package, and crossed the open space between White Hawk's circle and the marshal's office. Up close, Garrett looked tired and wary, but not hostile. His eyes flicked to the package, then to Gideon's face, then to the Apache warriors behind him, calculating odds, weighing options, trying to figure out how to navigate a situation that had no good outcomes. "Documents," Gideon said, holding up the package. "Land deed surveys letters between Governor Webb and Judge Crane. Proof that they forged Apache land grants, fake transactions, stole 10,000 acres through fraud. The man who owned my cabin before me, Samuel Hartwell, he was a lawyer. He found this evidence. They murdered him for it." "That's a serious accusation," Garrett said slowly. "That's a serious crime," Gideon countered. "And we've got the proof right here. Question is, are you willing to look at it?" For a long moment, the marshal didn't move. Gideon could see the war happening behind his eyes. Duty versus politics, law versus survival. Everyone knew Garrett was connected to Webb by marriage. Everyone knew where his interests lay. But everyone was also watching, and whatever he did next would define him for the rest of his career and possibly his life. "Give me the documents," Garrett said finally. Gideon handed them over. Garrett broke the seal, opened the leather folder, and began examining the papers. His expression didn't change much, but Gideon saw his jaw tighten, saw his eyes narrow, saw the moment when he understood exactly what he was looking at. "These need to be authenticated," Garrett said after several long minutes. "Examined by experts. I can't just—" "You can read," White Hawk called out. "You can see Governor Webb's signature, Judge Crane's seal. You can see the dates that prove these transactions are impossible. You can see the theft written in ink and sealed with wax. What more authentication do you need? The law requires you to act when presented with evidence of a crime," White Hawk said. His voice had gone cold hard. "We have ridden for 5 days through constant attack. We have lost good warriors so these documents could reach you. We have brought prisoners." He gestured toward the travois where Knox and his men lay bound, including Fletcher Knox, the governor's enforcer who murdered Samuel Hartwell and attempted to murder my granddaughter. He paused, letting that sink in. "Now you will choose justice or corruption. There is no middle path." The plaza had gone absolutely silent. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Garrett stood with the documents in his hands, trapped between what was right and what was safe, knowing that whatever he chose, people would die because of it. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Marshal Garrett, I'll take those documents." A man emerged from the courthouse, tall, well-dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Gideon had earned in his best year, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, flanked by 2 men who had the look of professional bodyguards. Gideon didn't need introductions. He knew power when he saw it, knew the particular arrogance that came from never being told no. This was someone important, someone dangerous. "Judge Crane," Garrett said, and the way he said it confirmed everything. So this was one of the architects of the theft, one of the men whose signature appeared again and again on forged documents. He'd come himself drawn by news of the Apache column, or by some warning system Gideon couldn't fathom. Either way, his presence meant things were about to get much worse. "These documents are stolen property," Crane said smoothly, still walking toward Garrett. "Part of an ongoing investigation into land fraud. I've been expecting them to surface." He reached for the papers. "I'll take custody of them as evidence in my case." "Don't give them to him," Gideon said sharply. Crane's eyes finally acknowledged Gideon's existence. "And you are—" "The man who found them hidden in a murdered lawyer's cabin," Gideon said. "Samuel Hartwell. Remember him? The man you had burned alive." Crane's expression didn't flicker, which was somehow more damning than any reaction would have been. "I don't know what you're talking about. Samuel Hartwell died in an unfortunate accident. Tragic, but these things happen on the frontier." "Accident," Gideon repeated. "Like how Naeli—" He gestured toward her. "Accidentally got strung up from a gate to send a message to her grandfather. Like how we've accidentally been attacked a dozen times riding here. Like how Fletcher Knox accidentally just happened to show up at my cabin the day I bought it." "Fletcher Knox is a territorial peace officer conducting official business," Crane said. "If he visited your property, it was in pursuit of fugitives." His eyes moved to Whitehawk. "Including members of your tribe who've been raiding settlements and disrupting commerce." "That is a lie," Whitehawk said flatly. "Is it—" Crane turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Citizens of Santa Fe, you see before you an Apache war party that has invaded our capital city. They bring wild accusations against your governor and your judiciary. They bring prisoners taken by force. They threaten violence if their demands aren't met." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "This is not how justice works. This is extortion." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Gideon saw the shift happening. Crane was good at this, had probably manipulated public opinion 1,000 times before. He was reframing the narrative, making Whitehawk the aggressor, making the Apache warriors look like invaders rather than victims seeking justice. "Marshal Garrett," Crane continued, "I'm ordering you to confiscate those documents as evidence in my investigation and to arrest these men for—" "No," Garrett said. The single word cut through Crane's speech like a knife. The judge's expression finally cracked surprise and anger flashing across his face. "What did you say?" "I said no." Garrett's grip tightened on the documents. "I've read these papers, Judge. I've seen the dates. I've seen the signatures. And I've seen enough frontier justice to know the difference between law and murder dressed up in fancy clothes." He looked at the crowd. "These documents require investigation. Real investigation, not the kind where evidence disappears and witnesses die. Until that investigation is complete, they stay in my custody. Official custody logged and witnessed by everyone here." Crane's face had gone red. "You're making a mistake, Marshal. A career-ending mistake." "Maybe," Garrett agreed. "But at least I'll be able to look myself in the mirror tomorrow." He turned to Whitehawk. "Chief, I'm placing these documents under federal protection. I'm also taking custody of your prisoners, including Fletcher Knox, pending investigation of multiple charges, including murder conspiracy and attempted murder. You and your warriors will need to make camp outside the city limits, but you have my word, my official word spoken before witnesses, that this evidence will be examined fairly." "Your word," Whitehawk said skeptically. "It's all I've got to give," Garrett said. "But it's all I've got to give. Take it or leave it." The old chief studied the marshal for a long moment. Gideon held his breath, aware that everything could still collapse into violence, that 40 warriors and 200 citizens and one wrong word could turn the plaza into an abattoir. "We will camp outside the city," Whitehawk said finally. "But we will be watching. If these documents disappear, if our prisoners escape, if any harm comes to Gideon Hale or my granddaughter, we will consider it an act of war, and we will respond accordingly." "Fair enough," Garrett said. Crane stepped forward, fury barely contained. "Marshal, I'm ordering you." Judge with respect, you don't have authority over federal law enforcement, Garrett interrupted. These are territorial matters touching on federal treaties and federal jurisdiction, which means I answer to the Federal Marshal Service, not to you. He paused. Now, if you want to file a complaint with my superiors, you're welcome to do that. But until they tell me otherwise, these documents stay with me. For a moment, Gideon thought Crane might do something stupid. The judge's hand twitched toward his jacket where a pistol might be concealed. His bodyguards tensed, reading their employer's mood. The Apache warriors shifted in their saddles, weapons suddenly more prominent. Then Crane visibly controlled himself, smoothed his expression into something approaching professional courtesy, and smiled that smile that didn't touch his eyes. Of course, Marshal, he said softly. I'll be filing that complaint first thing in the morning, along with several others. His gaze swept across Whitehawk, Gideon, Naeli. This isn't over. Not by a considerable margin. Never thought it was, Gideon said. Crane turned and walked back toward the courthouse, his bodyguards following, but Gideon noticed they didn't go inside. Instead, they took positions near the entrance, watching, waiting. Garrett noticed too. Deputy Morrison, he called to one of the young men behind him. Get every available man to the office. I want guards on these prisoners around the clock, and I want eyes on everyone who comes near the evidence room. Nobody touches those documents without my personal approval. Yes, sir, Morrison said, and disappeared inside at a run. Whitehawk began speaking in Apache, giving orders. The warriors started to move, preparing to withdraw to the city's outskirts as agreed. But before they left, the old chief rode close to Garrett. You have shown courage today, Marshal, he said. That is worth remembering. But courage without power is often just another word for dying nobly. Watch your back. Webb and Crane will not let this stand. I know, Garrett said, but sometimes a man's got to take a stand anyway. Otherwise, what's the point? Whitehawk nodded, a gesture of respect between two old warriors who understood that principle was expensive and necessary. Then he turned his horse and led his people toward the plaza's exit. Naeli rode past Gideon, pausing just long enough to catch his eye. Stay alive, 12-cent man, she said. We are not finished yet. Wouldn't dream of dying now, Gideon replied. Just when things are getting interesting. She actually smiled at that brief, fierce genuine. Then she was gone, following her grandfather into the gathering night, which left Gideon standing in the plaza with Marshal Garrett, surrounded by curious citizens, and the distinct feeling that he'd just painted the biggest target in the territory on his back. You got somewhere to stay? Garrett asked. Was planning to find a hotel, see? Gideon said. Bad idea. Every bounty hunter assassin and loyal Webb supporter in Santa Fe is going to be looking for you. You made yourself a symbol today, Hale. That means people who want to strike at what you represent are going to strike at you personally. Garrett thought for a moment. There's a room above the office. Not fancy, but it's got a lock, and I can post guards. You'll be safer there. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command disguised as an offer, and both of them knew it. But Garrett had a point. Gideon was a target now, whether he wanted to be or not. Appreciate it, Gideon said. They walked toward the marshal's office together, and Gideon noticed the crowd parting for them, keeping distance, watching with the kind of intense interest that came from seeing history happen in real time. Some faces showed support, others hostility, most just confusion and worry about what would happen next. Inside the office was exactly what Gideon expected: functional spare smelling of old coffee and gun oil, and the particular staleness that came from men who lived in small spaces doing hard work. A desk dominated the room, covered in papers that suggested Garrett was drowning in administrative requirements. Cells lined the back wall, currently empty. A gun rack held rifles and shotguns, locked but accessible. Garrett placed the document folder on his desk like it was a live snake, then looked at Gideon with eyes that had seen too much and not enough sleep. Tell me everything, he said. Start from when you bought that cabin and don't leave anything out. I need to know what I'm dealing with. So Gideon told him about the 12 cents and Hiram Teague's cryptic warnings, about finding Naeli on the gate and cutting her down, about Fletcher Knox's offer of $500 to walk away, about the siege of the cabin and Whitehawk's arrival and the documents hidden in the fireplace, about the ride to Santa Fe through constant attacks and ambushes, and the desperate hope that maybe possibly the law would work the way it was supposed to. Garrett listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Gideon finished, the marshal was quiet for a long time. "You realize what you've done," Garrett finally said. It wasn't a question. "Probably something stupid," Gideon admitted. "You've forced a confrontation between the territorial government and the federal government," Garrett said. "You've given the Apache proof of systematic fraud, which means if this doesn't get resolved legally, they've got justification for taking it to war. You've made enemies of some of the most powerful men in the territory." He paused. "And you've put me in a position where I have to choose between my career and my conscience." "Which are you choosing?" Gideon asked. "Already chose," Garrett said. "Back in the plaza. Now I've got to live with it." He walked to a locked cabinet and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Drink." "God, yes," Gideon said. They drank in silence, the whiskey burning warm and welcome after 5 days of fear and violence. Through the window, Gideon could see lights being lit all across Santa Fe, could hear the murmur of a city processing what had just happened and preparing for whatever came next. "Webb will come," Garrett said after his second drink. "Tomorrow, maybe the day after. He'll bring lawyers and writs and documents that make everything I did today look illegal. He'll pressure my superiors, call in favors, make promises and threats." He looked at the document folder on his desk. "Question is whether I can get these examined and authenticated before he shuts me down." "Who authenticates them?" Gideon asked. "Federal Surveyor's Office for the land documents, handwriting experts for the letters, federal judges for legal review judges from outside the territory who don't owe Webb anything." Garrett grimaced. "Problem is that takes time. Weeks, maybe months. And Webb won't give us weeks." "Then we make noise," Gideon said. "Newspapers, telegraph. Get the story out to places Webb's influence doesn't reach. Make it so loud that shutting us down becomes more expensive than letting the investigation proceed." Garrett looked at him with something approaching respect. "You've thought about this." "Had 5 days riding through people trying to kill me," Gideon said. "Gives you time to think. There's a newspaper here, the Santa Fe Gazette. Editor's name is Catherine Mendez. She's honest, brave, and hates corruption almost as much as she loves a good story." Garrett poured himself another drink. "Talk to her tomorrow. Tell her everything. Get it in print before Webb can stop it." "Will she believe me?" "She'll believe the documents," Garrett said. "And she'll believe her own eyes when she sees Apache warriors camped outside the city because they don't trust our justice system. That's a story that tells itself." A knock at the door interrupted them. Garrett's hand went to his gun before he called out, "Identify yourself." "Deputy Morrison, sir. Got the prisoners secured and guards posted." "Good. Bring Knox to me. Just Knox." There was a pause. "Sir, Judge Crane sent word that he wants to interview the prisoners. Says it's official judicial business. But tell Judge Crane he can submit a formal request through proper channels," Garrett said. "Tell him politely. But tell him." "Yes, sir." Footsteps retreated. Garrett looked at Gideon. "This is the part where things get dangerous." "As opposed to before?" Gideon asked. "Before was just violence," Garrett said. "Now comes the law. And the law can be more deadly than any gun when wielded by men like Crane and Webb." He stood. "Come on. You're going to want to hear what Knox has to say." They went back to the cells. Fletcher Knox sat in the middle one, his silver-white hat gone, his face still bearing the crusted blood from where Nayeli had shot his hat off. He looked smaller somehow, without his gang and his weapons and his confidence. But his eyes still held that calculation, that measuring of odds and angles. "Marshal," Knox said as they approached, "I'm glad you're here. These people kidnapped me, forced me to—" "Save it," Garrett interrupted. "Gideon Hale here tells me you showed up at his cabin the day he bought it, offered him $500 to hand over Nayeli and walk away. Then tried to burn the place down with both of them inside when he refused. That sound about right?" Knox's expression didn't change. "I was conducting official business on behalf of Governor Webb. The Apache woman was a fugitive. Hale interfered with murder," Garrett said flatly. "Samuel Hartwell. Remember him? The lawyer who used to own that cabin? The one who died in a barn fire that wasn't an accident. I don't know what you're talking about." "See, that's interesting," Garrett said. Because I've got documents that prove a conspiracy between Webb and Crane to steal Apache lands. I've got a dead lawyer who was about to expose that conspiracy. I've got a cabin where that lawyer hid his evidence. And I've got you showing up at that cabin the moment someone new took ownership. He leaned against the bars. You want to explain to me how all that's coincidence? Knox smiled cold knowing. You're a dead man marshal. You just don't know it yet. Maybe, Garrett agreed. But I'll die knowing I did the right thing. Can you say the same? I can say I'll die rich and comfortable in my bed, Knox replied, while you'll die poor and forgotten in some alley because you crossed men who shouldn't be crossed. He looked at Gideon. And you 12-cent land and delusions of heroism. Webb's going to grind you to dust. Your name will become a cautionary tale, something mothers use to scare their children. Don't be like Gideon Hale, who thought he could fight power with principle and died screaming for his stupidity. Eloquent, Gideon said. You practiced that speech. I've given versions of it to dozens of dead men, Knox said. You'll just be the latest. Garrett straightened. That's enough. Morrison makes sure Knox stays comfortable. And make sure he doesn't talk to anyone, not lawyers, not judges, not his own mother if she shows up. Complete isolation until I say otherwise. On what authority? Knox demanded. On the authority of a federal marshal conducting an investigation into conspiracy murder and a whole list of other charges I haven't written down yet, Garrett said. You want to challenge that, get a lawyer. But the lawyer's going to tell you I'm within my rights. They left Knox glaring through the bars and returned to the main office. Gideon felt exhausted suddenly, the adrenaline that had carried him through the plaza confrontation draining away and leaving him hollow. The room upstairs, Garrett said, noticing. Go get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be busy talking to the newspaper, dealing with Webb's response, probably fighting off assassination attempts. You'll need your strength. You think Webb will actually try to kill me in Santa Fe? Gideon asked. In the middle of the territorial capital. I think Webb will do whatever he thinks he can get away with, Garrett said. And he's gotten away with a lot over the years, so yeah, watch your back, lock your door, sleep light. The room upstairs was exactly what Garrett had promised, not fancy. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out over the plaza, and a lock that worked. Gideon secured the door, checked the window, and positioned the chair where he could see both. The Colt went on the small table beside the bed, loaded and ready. He lay down without undressing, too tired to care about propriety, and stared at the ceiling while the sounds of Santa Fe drifted through the thin walls. Horses in the street, people talking. Someone playing a guitar badly, but with enthusiasm. Normal sounds of a city at night, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis earlier that evening. Sleep came eventually, but it was the shallow kind, full of half-dreams where Knox laughed and Crane smiled, and Webb's face, which Gideon had never actually seen, loomed over everything like a thundercloud. He woke to pounding on the door and pale light coming through the window. Morning! He'd actually slept, which seemed miraculous. Hale! Garrett's voice came through the door. Get up. We've got problems. Gideon was on his feet with the Colt in his hand before he was fully conscious. What kind of problems? The kind where Governor Webb just arrived in Santa Fe with 50 territorial militia and a writ from the Territorial Supreme Court ordering me to release all prisoners and surrender all evidence in my custody. A pause. And the kind where Judge Crane just issued a warrant for your arrest on charges of inciting an Indian uprising. Gideon opened the door. Garrett stood there looking like he'd aged a decade overnight, holding papers that probably represented the end of his career, if not his life. How long do we have? Gideon asked. An hour, maybe 2. Webb's making a show of following proper procedure, filing paperwork, assembling his legal team, giving me time to reconsider my position. Garrett handed Gideon one of the papers. But make no mistake, he's coming. And when he does, things are going to get ugly fast. Gideon read the warrant. It was exactly what Garrett said, charges of inciting violence, conspiracy to riot, about a dozen other accusations that basically added up to, you made powerful people angry, and now you'll pay for it. We need to move fast, Gideon said. Get to that newspaper editor. Get the story out before Webb can shut us down. Already sent word to Catherine Mendez, Garrett said. She's waiting at the Gazette office. But Hale, once you talk to her, once this story's in print, there's no going back. Webb and Crane will come at you with everything they have. Legal, illegal, doesn't matter. You'll have to watch over your shoulder for the rest of your life. Been doing that anyway, Gideon said. Might as well make it count for something. They went downstairs. The office was full of deputies now, 8 men, all armed, all looking worried but determined. These were Garrett's people loyal to him personally, and they'd apparently decided to stand with him even though it meant standing against the territorial government. Morrison, Garrett said to his senior deputy, take Hale to the Gazette. Armed escort, 4 men. Anyone tries to stop you, arrest them. Anyone pulls a weapon, defend yourselves. Clear. Crystal, sir, Morrison said. He was maybe 25 with red hair and freckles that made him look younger, but his eyes were steady. What about the governor? I'll handle Webb, Garrett said. You just make sure Hale lives long enough to tell his story. They left through the back door, 5 men moving quickly through Santa Fe's waking streets. The city was just coming to life, shops, opening, people beginning their day, the smell of bread baking and coffee brewing. Normal life continuing even though everything was about to change. The Santa Fe Gazette occupied a narrow building squeezed between a dry goods store and a lawyer's office. Through the front window, Gideon could see a printing press and stacks of paper and ink-stained hands working on tomorrow's edition. Morrison knocked. A woman appeared, maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that assessed Gideon in about 3 seconds, and apparently found him interesting enough to let inside. Catherine Mendez, she said, extending an ink-stained hand. You're Gideon Hale. Yes, ma'am, Gideon said. Good. We don't have much time. She gestured to a desk covered in paper. Tell me everything. And I mean everything, dates, names, details. I want a story so airtight that Webb can't discredit it no matter how hard he tries. So for the second time in less than 12 hours, Gideon told his story. But this time he knew it was going to be printed, distributed, read by hundreds or thousands of people. This time he was creating a record that couldn't be erased or disappeared or burned in a convenient fire. Mendez took notes furiously, occasionally interrupting to ask clarifying questions or demand more specific details. She was relentless, precise, clearly. Someone who understood that sloppy journalism got people killed while good journalism sometimes saved them. The documents, she said when Gideon finished. Can I see them? They're in Garrett's custody, Gideon said. But he might let you examine. The sound of gunfire cut him off. Not close, but not far either. 3 shots in quick succession, then a pause, then more, coming from the direction of the marshal's office. Morrison's hand went to his gun. That's trouble. Go, Mendez said sharply. I've got enough for the story. Go help your marshal. They ran. The plaza was in chaos when they arrived. Citizens fleeing in all directions. Militia soldiers in territorial uniforms forming a line in front of the courthouse. And in the center of it all, Governor Richard Webb. He was younger than Gideon expected, maybe 50, with dark hair just starting to gray, and the kind of face that photographed well and hid a multitude of sins. He wore an expensive suit and stood like a man who'd never been told no in his life, flanked by Judge Crane and what looked like a small army of soldiers and hired guns. Facing them was Marshal Garrett and his 8 deputies outnumbered 6-1, but holding their ground in front of the office door. This is your last chance, Marshal, Webb was saying as Gideon and Morrison pushed through the crowd. Surrender the documents and the prisoners, resign your position, and I'll forget this little rebellion. Refuse, and I'll have you arrested for obstructing justice and conspiracy. Those documents are evidence in a federal investigation, Garrett said. His voice was steady, but Gideon could see the tension in his shoulders. You've got no authority to— I have the authority of the Territorial Supreme Court, Webb interrupted, waving the writ, which supersedes your federal jurisdiction. Now stand aside or I'll order my men to remove you by force. Try it, Garrett said. For a moment, the entire plaza held its breath. 50 territorial soldiers with rifles leveled at 8 deputies with revolvers. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and the whole thing would explode into a bloodbath. Then a new voice joined the confrontation. Perhaps we should all take a moment to reconsider. A man stepped forward from the crowd, older, maybe 70, with white hair and clothes that marked him as military, even though he wore no uniform. He walked with the authority of someone who'd commanded large forces in situations much more dangerous than this. And when Webb saw him, something like worry crossed the governor's face. General Hawthorne. Webb said, his tone cautious. This doesn't concern you. On the contrary, Hawthorne replied. When the territorial government threatens federal law enforcement over matters involving Indian treaties, it concerns me very much. Those treaties were negotiated under federal authority, which means violations of those treaties are federal crimes, which means Marshal Garrett is well within his rights to investigate them. With respect, General, you're retired. Crane interjected. You have no official... With respect, Judge, I may be retired, but I still have the ear of every serving general from here to Washington, Hawthorne said mildly. And if word reaches them that territorial officials are obstructing federal investigations into treaty violations, well, the Army takes that sort of thing seriously, very seriously. The threat was implicit, but clear. Webb could force the issue here and now, could use his soldiers to seize the documents and arrest Garrett. But doing so would bring federal attention. He couldn't control military intervention. He couldn't stop in consequences that would end his career and possibly his freedom. Webb's face had gone pale. He looked at Crane, at his soldiers, at the crowd, watching everything. Calculating odds, measuring costs, trying to find an angle that didn't end with him destroyed. This isn't over, he finally said to Garrett. Not by a long shot. I'm filing formal complaints with your superiors requesting a full investigation into your conduct and demanding jurisdiction be transferred to territorial authority. You do that, Garrett said. Webb turned to leave, then paused when he saw Gideon. Recognition sparked in his eyes. Not personal recognition, but the recognition of someone who'd become a symbol, a problem, a target. Gideon Hale, Webb said softly. The 12-cent landowner. Do you have any idea what you've started? I know what you started, Gideon replied. I'm just making sure it ends. Brave words, Webb said. We'll see if you're still saying them when everything you care about is ashes. He looked back at Garrett. And Marshal, you might want to check on your family. It would be tragic if something happened to them while you were busy playing hero. It was a naked threat delivered in public, and the fact that Webb felt comfortable making it showed exactly how confident he was in his power and his impunity. Garrett's hand moved toward his gun. For a heartbeat, Gideon thought the marshal might actually shoot the governor in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses. But Hawthorne put a hand on Garrett's arm. Don't, the old general said quietly. That's what he wants. Give him an excuse to call this a violent uprising and bring in federal troops to restore order, his version of order. Garrett's hand stopped. Webb smiled that same cold, knowing smile and walked away with his soldiers and his judge and his absolute certainty that power would triumph over principle because it always had before. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people talking in low voices, processing what they'd witnessed. Gideon stood with Morrison and the other deputies watching Webb disappear into the courthouse and felt the weight of what was coming settle over him like a shroud. That, Morrison said quietly, was the governor of New Mexico Territory threatening to murder a federal marshal's family. That, Hawthorne corrected, was the governor making the mistake of threatening a federal marshal's family in front of me, which means I'll be sending a full report to Washington by telegram within the hour. He looked at Garrett. You've got protection now, Marshal. Not much, but some. Use it wisely. Thank you, General, Garrett said. Hawthorne nodded and walked away, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who'd navigated worse situations and survived them all. Gideon turned to Garrett. Now what? Now we wait, Garrett said. The story will be in tomorrow's Gazette. Word will spread. And either Webb will find a way to shut us down before that happens, or he won't. Either way. He looked at the courthouse where the governor had disappeared. This is about to get much worse before it gets better. The words turned out to be prophetic in ways Gideon hadn't imagined. They barely made it back inside the marshal's office before the first attempt came. A man in a dusty coat walked past the building casual as Sunday morning, then suddenly wheeled with a pistol in his hand. He got one shot off the bullet, punching through the window and burying itself in the wall behind Garrett's desk before Morrison put him down with a rifle shot that echoed across the plaza like a thunderclap. People scattered. The wounded assassin writhed on the ground for maybe 10 seconds before going still. And Santa Fe learned that whatever was happening between the marshal and the governor had moved beyond words into something darker and more final. Get him off the street, Garrett ordered, his voice tight. Search him. I want to know who hired him. Two deputies dragged the body away while Morrison and the others took positions at the windows, rifles ready. Gideon stood in the middle of the office feeling useless and exposed the Colt heavy in his hand, but offering little comfort against an enemy that could strike from anywhere. "You should move away from the windows," Morrison said without looking at him. Gideon did, pressing his back against the interior wall. Through the glass, he could see citizens gathering at a safe distance, pointing, talking. News of the shooting would spread through Santa Fe within minutes. Within an hour, everyone in the territory would know that someone had tried to kill the marshal, or Gideon, or both in broad daylight. The question was whether that would help or hurt their cause. Garrett was already moving, checking his deputies, repositioning them for better fields of fire, turning the office into a fortress. He'd clearly done this before, maybe during the war or in some frontier town where violence was currency. His hands were steady, his voice calm, but Gideon could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. "We can't stay here," Gideon said. "We're sitting ducks. Webb can send assassins all day, and eventually one will get through." "Where do you suggest we go?" Garrett asked. "Out into the open where they can hit us from any direction. At least here we've got walls and positions." "What about White Hawk?" Gideon said. "The Apache camp. Webb can't attack us there without starting the war he's trying to avoid." Garrett paused, considering. "You're suggesting a federal marshal take refuge with an Apache war party." "I'm suggesting we go where we've got allies and numbers," Gideon said. "Right now we've got 8 deputies against however many guns Webb can buy. That's not sustainable." Morrison spoke up from his window position. "He's got a point, Marshal. We can hold this office for a while, but if Webb's serious about taking us out, he'll just wait until we're exhausted and then hit us hard. Better to consolidate with friendlies." Garrett looked around at his deputies. To a man, they nodded. These were good men, loyal men, but they weren't stupid. They knew the odds. "All right," Garrett said. "We move the prisoners and the evidence to White Hawk's camp. Set up a defensive perimeter there. Force Webb to either negotiate or attack an Apache camp with territorial militia, which would bring the federal government down on his head so fast it'd make his head spin." He started giving orders. "Morrison, get horses from the livery. Taylor, round up supplies, food, ammunition, medical gear. Henderson, you're with me, we're moving the prisoners." The office erupted into controlled chaos as men moved with purpose. Within 20 minutes, they had Knox and his surviving men shackled and ready to move the documents secured in a locked satchel that Garrett wore across his chest, and horses assembled in the alley behind the building. "We go fast and we go quiet," Garrett said. "Anyone tries to stop us, we go through them. Anyone takes a shot, we shoot back. Clear." A chorus of acknowledgments. Then they were moving, slipping out the back door into the alley, mounting up, forming a column with prisoners in the middle and armed men on all sides. Gideon found himself next to Henderson, a grizzled deputy who looked like he'd been born suspicious and gotten more so with age. "You know how to use that Colt?" Henderson asked, eyeing Gideon's weapon. "Well enough," Gideon said. "Well enough gets you killed in a gunfight," Henderson said. "You see trouble, you point and squeeze. Don't think. Don't aim fancy. Just point and squeeze until the threat stops moving." "That's encouraging." "Wasn't meant to be encouraging," Henderson said. "Was meant to keep you alive long enough to matter." They rode out of the alley at a trot, turning north toward the city limits where White Hawk's camp lay. The streets were busier now, mid-morning traffic, people going about their business, the city trying to pretend everything was normal, even though everyone knew it wasn't. Gideon saw faces turn as they passed, saw recognition dawn, saw some people duck inside, others reach for weapons they probably didn't have, still others just watch with the flat curiosity of folks witnessing history and hoping it didn't bite them. They made it 3 blocks before the second attempt came. This time it wasn't a lone assassin, but a coordinated ambush. 4 men stepped from a saloon just ahead, pistols already drawn and firing. The lead deputy's horse went down screaming, throwing its rider hard into the street. Bullets whined past Gideon's head close enough that he felt the wind of their passage. Henderson returned fire instantly, his revolver roaring in Gideon's ear. The other deputies followed suit, and suddenly the street was a storm of gunfire and smoke and chaos. Citizens scattered, diving into doorways, throwing themselves flat. A woman screamed. Glass shattered as stray bullets found windows. Gideon pointed the Colt like Henderson had instructed and squeezed. The gun bucked. One of the ambushers stumbled but didn't fall. Gideon fired again. This time the man went down. He'd just killed someone, had killed someone, and there was no time to process that, no time for horror or guilt or anything except survival. Move, move! Garrett was shouting, spurring his horse forward. The column lurched into motion, riding hard through the ambush, leaving the dead and dying behind. Gideon heard more shots, felt his horse shudder, but keep running, and then they were past the saloon and galloping through Santa Fe, like the devil himself was chasing them. Which maybe he was in the form of Governor Webb and all his hired killers. They didn't slow until they reached the city limits. Behind them, Santa Fe was a confusion of shouting and smoke. Ahead, the open ground that led to Whitehawk's camp looked exposed and dangerous, but it was their only option now. "Anyone hit?" Garrett called out. "Thompson's got a graze on his arm," Morrison reported. "Johnson's horse is bleeding but still moving. Everyone else is intact." "What about the prisoners, Chip? Shaken but alive." "Good. Let's move before they regroup." They rode hard across the open ground, and Gideon saw Apache sentries emerge from cover positions he hadn't even noticed they were holding. These warriors had been watching the city, had probably seen everything that just happened, and they fell in alongside the column as escorts. Whitehawk's camp was larger than Gideon remembered, maybe 60 warriors now, with more arriving throughout the morning as word spread through the Apache networks. They'd set up a defensive perimeter using the natural terrain with clear sightlines in all directions and positions that would turn any attack into a bloodbath for the attackers. The old chief appeared as they rode, and his expression unreadable as he took in the wounded men and the obvious signs of combat. "Marshal Garrett," Whitehawk said, "I did not expect you to join us so soon." "Neither did I," Garrett admitted, dismounting. "But circumstances changed. Webb's sending assassins. We had 2 attempts in one morning. Figured we'd be safer here than trying to hold the office." "So you seek the protection of savages," Whitehawk said. There was something sharp in his voice, a challenge or a test. "I seek the protection of allies," Garrett corrected. "There's a difference." Whitehawk studied the marshal for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, there is." He gestured toward the center of the camp. "Bring your prisoners and your evidence. We will talk." They gathered in a large tent that served as Whitehawk's command post. The old chief sat on a blanket with Naeli beside him, while Garrett and Gideon sat across from them. The deputies stood guard outside, mingling with Apache warriors in an alliance that should have been impossible, but necessity had made real. "Show me the documents again," Whitehawk said. Garrett opened the satchel and spread the papers between them. Land deeds with forged dates. Letters discussing the division of stolen territory. Survey maps that showed Apache lands being carved up like a pie among Webb's cronies. All of it documented, signed, sealed, and absolutely damning. Whitehawk read through each paper slowly, his face growing harder with each revelation. When he finished, he looked at Naeli and spoke in Apache. She responded, her voice low and intense. They argued briefly, not angrily, but with the passion of people who cared deeply about the outcome. Finally, Whitehawk turned back to Garrett and Gideon. "My granddaughter says we should take these documents to the newspapers ourselves. Ride to every town in the territory, show the evidence to everyone who will look. Force the truth into the open so completely that Webb cannot hide from it." "That could work," Garrett said slowly, "but it would take time. And it would mean abandoning any pretense of legal process. You'd be acting outside the law." "The law has not served my people," Whitehawk said flatly. "Why should we trust it now?" "Because if you don't," Garrett said, "if you go outside the law, then Webb wins. He gets to paint you as violent savages who rejected civilization and justice. He gets to call in the army to restore order. He gets to make your uprising justified, as it would be, and to proof that Indians can't be trusted with legal rights." He paused. "But if we do this legally, if we force the system to work the way it's supposed to, then we set a precedent. We show that the law can work for everyone, not just the powerful. We make it harder for the next Webb to steal from the next tribe." "Pretty words," Naeli said. "But will they stop bullets? Will they feed children whose parents were murdered for land that was rightfully theirs?" "No," Garrett admitted. "But they might stop the next generation of bullets, the next round of murders. They might make a world where your grandchildren don't have to fight the same battles you're fighting now." Whitehawk was quiet for a long time. Outside, Gideon could hear the sounds of the campmen talking, horses being tended, weapons being cleaned. Normal sounds of warriors preparing for battle that might never come, or might come any moment. "What do you propose?" White Hawk finally asked. "We hold here," Garrett said. "We've got the evidence, the prisoners, and enough witnesses to make our case. I've sent word to my superiors in Washington. General Hawthorne is backing that communication. Within a week, maybe less federal investigators will arrive. Real investigators, not territorial cronies. They'll examine the documents, interview witnesses, and if everything checks out the way I think it will, they'll bring charges against Webb and Crane." "A week," White Hawk said. "You ask us to wait a week while Webb sends assassins and mobilizes his militia and works to destroy the evidence." "I'm asking you to give the law a chance," Garrett said. 1 week. If nothing happens, if the investigators don't come, or Webb manages to bury this, then you're free to take whatever action you think necessary. But give the system a chance to work first. Why should we? Because Gideon spoke up for the first time. If we don't try to do this right, then what was Samuel Hartwell's death for? What was Naeli's suffering for? What was that whole ride from Liberty for? He looked at White Hawk directly. "We've got something here that could change everything, not just for the Apache, but for every tribe that's been cheated and lied to and stolen from. But only if we use it right. Only if we prove that the system can deliver justice when forced to face the truth." White Hawk's gaze moved between Garrett and Gideon, weighing their words against years of experience that said white men's promises were worthless and their justice was a cruel joke. 1 week, he finally said. "We will hold this camp. We will protect the evidence and the marshal and the 12-cent man who started this madness. But if your investigators do not come, if they come but do nothing, if Webb escapes justice," his voice went cold and hard, "then my warriors ride. We will take this evidence to every tribe between here and California. We will show them what was done to us, and we will let them decide whether peace or war better serves their children." It was the best deal they were going to get, and everyone knew it. "Agreed, Garrett said. He extended his hand. After a moment, White Hawk took it. The handshake between a federal marshal and an Apache chief felt like something significant, a bridge across a divide that had claimed thousands of lives. They spent the rest of the day fortifying the camp. Garrett's deputies taught Apache warriors about defensive positions using white military tactics, while the warriors showed the deputies how to use terrain and concealment in ways the Army manual never covered. It was an exchange of knowledge born from mutual necessity, and Gideon watched it with something approaching hope. Maybe this could work. Maybe they actually had a chance. That hope lasted until sunset when a rider approached the camp under a white flag. The sentries brought him in carefully, weapons trained on him the entire way. He was young, maybe 20, wearing expensive clothes that marked him as someone's messenger rather than someone important himself. He looked terrified but determined. Riding into an Apache camp alone took either courage or desperation. "I have a message," he said when he reached the center of camp. His voice shook but held. "From Governor Webb. He requests a parley. Tomorrow at noon in the plaza. Just him and Marshal Garrett. No weapons, no soldiers, no warriors, just 2 men talking." "A trap?" Naeli said immediately. "Maybe," Garrett said. "Or maybe Webb realizes he can't win this by force and wants to negotiate." "Men like Webb do not negotiate," White Hawk said. "They dominate or they destroy. There is no middle ground." "Then let's find out which he's planning," Garrett said. He looked at the messenger. "Tell the governor I accept. Noon tomorrow. But if anything happens to me, if I disappear or die or get arrested, then every document I'm holding gets sent to newspapers in 5 territories. Make sure he understands that." The messenger nodded frantically and rode away as fast as his horse could carry him. When he was gone, Morrison turned to Garrett. "Sir, you can't seriously be considering this. It's suicide." "It's an opportunity," Garrett corrected. "Webb doesn't offer to talk unless he thinks he can gain something from it. Maybe he wants to buy me off. Maybe he wants to threaten me more directly. Maybe he actually wants to find a way out of this mess that doesn't end with bodies piling up." He shrugged. "Either way, I need to hear what he has to say." "I'm coming with you," Gideon said. No. Yes, Gideon insisted. You need a witness. Someone Webb can intimidate or buy. Someone who's got as much stake in this as you do. Someone he can kill, Garrett said bluntly. That's what you're volunteering for. Been volunteering for that since I cut Naeli down from that gate, Gideon said. Might as well keep being stupid consistently. Despite the tension, several people smiled at that. Even Naeli's expression softened slightly. Fine, Garrett said. You come, but you stay quiet and you stay back. This is my conversation with Webb. You're just there to witness and remember. That night, Gideon couldn't sleep. He lay in a tent the Apache had provided, staring at canvas above him and thinking about tomorrow. About walking into the plaza to meet a man who'd proven he'd kill to protect his secrets. About betting everything on the hope that Webb would rather negotiate than escalate into open warfare. It was a thin hope at best. Naeli appeared at his tent entrance sometime after midnight, a dark shape against darker shadows. You are awake, she said. Not a question. Can't sleep, Gideon admitted. Keep thinking about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. That is wisdom, she said. The ways it could go wrong outnumber the ways it could go right by considerable margin. She paused. May I sit? It's your camp. She entered and sat cross-legged near the entrance, close enough to talk quietly, but maintaining that careful distance. In the dim light from the fire outside, Gideon could see her face had healed some, the swelling gone down the cuts scabbing over. But the rope burns on her neck were still visible, dark marks that would probably scar. Why did you do it? She asked after a moment. The truth, not the heroic version you tell others. Why did you cut me down from that gate? Gideon had been asked this question so many times now that he should have had a rehearsed answer. But with Naeli in the darkness, with tomorrow's danger looming, he found himself telling the truth he'd barely admitted to himself. Because I was already dead inside, he said quietly. Had been for months. Lost everything, land, purpose, hope. Was just drifting through each day waiting to die without having the courage to make it happen faster. He looked at her. Then I saw you hanging there, and something in me woke up. Maybe it was anger at people who do that. Maybe it was recognition of suffering like my own. Maybe it was just that I needed something to fight for, and you were there. He paused. So I cut you down. And cutting you down gave me a reason to keep living, selfish maybe, but true. Naeli absorbed this in silence. Then she said, Among my people there is a saying, a life saved creates a bond that cannot be severed by distance or time or death. You saved my life. That makes us connected. Family in a way that goes beyond blood. I don't need, Gideon started. I am not offering you a debt, Naeli interrupted. I am offering you kinship. There is a difference. A debt is paid and finished. Kinship is forever. She met his eyes. Tomorrow, when you walk into that plaza to face Webb, you will not walk alone. You will carry my strength with you and my grandfather's wisdom and the spirit of every warrior in this camp. That is what it means to be family. Gideon felt something catch in his throat. For 6 months he'd been alone, truly alone in a way that went beyond physical presence. Now in the middle of an Apache war camp facing death tomorrow, he was being offered family. Thank you, Bus, he managed. Naeli nodded and stood. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow requires clear eyes and steady hand. I will stand watch outside your tent. No harm will come to you before you face Webb. This, I promise. She left and Gideon lay back down. Somehow knowing she was out there, knowing he wasn't alone, he finally managed to sleep. He woke to gray dawn and the smell of coffee. Garrett was already up checking his weapons with the methodical care of a man who expected to need them. The deputies were doing the same while Apache warriors moved through the camp with quiet purpose. 2 hours, Garrett said when he saw Gideon. Eat something, check your weapon. Make peace with whatever God you believe in. Then we ride into Santa Fe and see if Governor Webb wants to talk or wants to start a war. They ate in silence, jerky and hardtack and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Gideon cleaned the Colt again, checked each cartridge, satisfied himself that the gun would work when needed. Then he stood and looked around the camp. 60 Apache warriors preparing for battle they hoped wouldn't come. 8 federal deputies who'd chosen principle over safety. One old chief who'd seen his people's world destroyed and was trying to save what remained. One woman who refused to die quietly. And one broke rancher with 12 cents worth of land and a death warrant on his head. It was a strange alliance. It was also the only hope any of them had. At 11:30, Gideon and Garrett rode out of camp with an escort of warriors who would take them to the city limits and no further. Whitehawk had wanted to send more, but Garrett had refused. This parley required the appearance of good faith, even if none of them truly believed Webb operated in good faith. They reached Santa Fe's outskirts by quarter to noon. The warriors melted away into defensive positions, watching ready to respond if the parley went wrong. Garrett and Gideon rode the last stretch alone, 2 men on horseback, heading into a city that had tried to kill them yesterday. The plaza was empty when they arrived. Not naturally empty, deliberately emptied. No citizens, no merchants, no normal activity. Just open space and silent buildings and the sense of hundreds of eyes watching from behind shuttered windows. In the center of the plaza stood Governor Webb. He was alone, as promised, with no visible weapons. But Gideon noticed armed men on rooftops around the square, territorially militia in uniform, positioned for clear shots. The white flag only extended so far, apparently. They dismounted 50 feet from Webb and walked the rest of the way. Garrett moved with confidence, but Gideon noticed his hand stayed near his belt, where a hidden knife probably rested. No guns, the agreement had said. Nothing about knives. "Marshal," Webb said as they approached. His voice was cordial, almost friendly. "Thank you for coming, and Mr. Hale. I'm glad you're here too. Saves me the trouble of delivering my message separately." "What message?" Garrett asked. "That you've lost," Webb said simply. "I know you've contacted your superiors in Washington. I know you've got documents you think prove wrongdoing. I know you're hoping federal investigators will ride in and save the day." He smiled. "But here's what you don't know. Your superiors have already decided not to pursue this investigation. Too politically sensitive. Too much risk of sparking an Indian war. Too many important people who would be damaged by a full inquiry." "You're lying," Garrett said. "Am I?" Webb pulled a telegram from his pocket and held it up. "This arrived this morning. Read it yourself." Garrett took the telegram, and Gideon watched the marshal's face go pale as he read. "What does it say?" Gideon asked. Garrett's voice was hollow. "It says the investigation is closed. Lack of credible evidence. It says I'm ordered to return all documents to territorial authority. It says if I fail to comply, I'll be relieved of duty and arrested for insubordination." Webb's smile widened. "You see, the system you put so much faith in has decided you're not worth the trouble. Now you have a choice. Surrender the documents, release my men, and accept a generous severance package that will let you retire comfortably. Or refuse, lose everything, and watch while I crush you and everyone who supported you." "What about the Apache?" Gideon asked. "What about the land you stole?" "What about it?" Webb said. "They're Indians, Mr. Hale. They have no standing in our courts, no rights we're bound to respect. They can complain all they want, but at the end of the day, we have the army, and they have bows and arrows. The outcome was never in doubt." "You son of a—" Gideon started forward, but Garrett's hand on his arm stopped him. "Is that your final offer?" Garrett asked Webb. His voice was carefully controlled. "Surrender or be destroyed." "I'm trying to be reasonable," Webb said. "Trying to give you a way out that doesn't end with your death and the deaths of everyone who followed you. Take it. Walk away. Live to fight another day." Garrett looked down at the telegram in his hand, then at Webb, then at the armed men on the rooftops, calculating odds, measuring costs, trying to find a path forward that didn't lead to slaughter. "I need to discuss this with Whitehawk," Garrett finally said. "You have until sunset," Webb said. "After that, I stop being reasonable and start being decisive. And Mr. Hale?" He looked at Gideon directly. "When this is over, when Marshal Garrett has made the sensible choice, I'm going to take particular pleasure in making sure you understand the cost of defying me. Your 12-cent cabin will burn. Your name will become synonymous with foolish pride. And you'll spend whatever days you have left wishing you'd walked past that Apache girl and kept your head down." Looking forward to it, Gideon said through clenched teeth. They walked back to their horses in silence. Behind them, Webb called out one more time. Sunset Marshal, choose wisely. They rode out of Santa Fe at a gallop, neither speaking until they were well clear of the city. When they finally slowed, Garrett looked at Gideon with eyes that held something Gideon had never seen there before. Defeat. He's won, Garrett said quietly. Webb's won. My superiors have abandoned us. The system has failed, and I don't know what to do next. Gideon thought about 12 cents, an accursed cabin, and a woman hanging from a gate. Thought about 5 days of violence and 5 days of hope. Thought about Samuel Hartwell dying for truth, and Whitehawk fighting for his people, and Naeli refusing to surrender even when death seemed certain. Then we stop playing by their rules, Gideon said. We take those documents and we spread them so far and so wide that Webb can't possibly contain them. Every newspaper, every telegraph office, every town between here and San Francisco. We make the truth so loud it drowns out all his lies and all his power. That's not justice, Garrett said. That's vigilantism. Maybe, Gideon admitted, but it's all we've got left, and sometimes when the system fails, you've got to make your own justice. They rode back to camp in silence, each lost in thought about choices that would determine whether the coming night brought surrender or revolution. Whitehawk's face remained impassive as Garrett relayed Webb's ultimatum, but Gideon saw the old chief's hands tighten on his rifle. Around them, warriors had gathered to hear the news, and the silence that followed Garrett's words was the kind that preceded storms. So the white man's justice proves itself a lie, Whitehawk finally said, as it always has, as it always will. Not all of us, Garrett said quietly. Some of us are still trying. Trying is not the same as succeeding, Naeli said from beside her grandfather. We gave the law its chance. We rode for 5 days. We endured attacks. We brought evidence that should have condemned Webb and Crane 100 times over. And the response from your government is to order you to surrender and go home quietly. Her voice held a bitter edge. Tell me, Marshal, how is this different from every other time we trusted white promises? Garrett had no answer. He looked down at the telegram still clutched in his hand, the paper crumpled from his grip during the ride back. The words hadn't changed. His superiors had abandoned him, abandoned the investigation, abandoned everything they were supposed to stand for. There's another way, Gideon said into the silence. All eyes turned to him. He felt the weight of those stares, warriors who'd fought beside him, a marshal who'd risked everything on principle, an old chief watching his people's last hope slip away, and Naeli, whose life he'd saved, and who'd become something more than an ally in the days since. We don't surrender, Gideon continued, and we don't wait for permission from men in Washington who've decided we're too inconvenient to support. We take those documents and we make copies, dozens of copies. We send them to every newspaper in 5 territories. We telegraph the story to San Francisco, Denver, St. Louis, New York. We make this so public, so widespread that Webb can't possibly contain it. That won't bring justice, Garrett said. That's just revenge. No, Gideon corrected. Justice is when the system works. Revenge is when you hurt someone because they hurt you. This is something else. This is making sure the truth survives even if we don't. Maybe Webb escapes legal consequences. Maybe he buys his way out, or intimidates the right people, or just outlasts the scandal, but he won't be able to steal Apache lands anymore. He won't be able to forge deeds and murder witnesses and operate in shadow, because everyone will know what he did. And when everyone knows, Whitehawk said slowly, understanding, other tribes will know to watch for the same deception. Other lawyers will know to question land transfers. Other federal marshals will know corruption reaches the highest levels. He nodded. You are speaking of a different kind of victory. Not punishment for the guilty, but protection for the innocent. Exactly, Gideon said. Morrison spoke up from where he stood with the other deputies. Marshal, if we do this, we're finished as lawmen. Webb will make sure every agency in the country knows we went rogue. We'll never work in law enforcement again. I know, Garrett said. Just want to make sure you understand the cost, Morrison said. Then he smiled fierce and committed. Because we're with you anyway, all of us. We didn't become deputies to protect corrupt governors. We did it to serve justice. And if the only way to do that is outside the system, then that's what we do. The other deputies nodded their agreement. These were men who'd already chosen the hard path by standing with Garrett in Santa Fe. Now they were choosing it again, knowing full well it meant ending their careers and possibly their lives. Garrett looked at each of them, then at Whitehawk, then at the documents still in his possession. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and resolved. "All right," he said. "We do it Gideon's way. We make copies and spread them everywhere. We force the truth into daylight so bright that even Webb's money and power can't create enough shadow to hide in." He looked at Whitehawk. "But I need your help. I need riders, fast riders who can reach towns before Webb's men can intercept them. I need warriors who can protect the people making copies, and I need your word that this ends peacefully. No attacks on Santa Fe, no retaliation against settlers, no matter how much they might deserve it." "You ask much," Whitehawk said. "I'm asking for restraint when rage would be easier," Garrett agreed. "I'm asking you to let history judge Webb instead of taking that judgment into your own hands. I'm asking you to trust that spreading the truth will ultimately serve your people better than spreading blood." Whitehawk was silent for a long time. Around them the camp had gone quiet, every warrior listening, waiting for their chief's decision. This was the moment when everything would be decided: peace or war, law or vengeance, hope or fury. "My granddaughter says the 12-cent man has earned trust," Whitehawk finally said, glancing at Naeli. She nodded confirmation. "And I have seen that you, Marshal, are not like other white lawmen. You stand for something beyond your own advancement." He took a deep breath. "Very well. My warriors will ride. We will protect your copyists. We will deliver your truth to every corner of this territory and beyond. But understand this: if Webb attacks us during this effort, if he kills our riders or burns the documents or harms those under our protection, then the restraint ends. Then we respond as warriors must." "Fair enough," Garrett said. They spent the next hour planning. Catherine Mendez from the Santa Fe Gazette was summoned to the camp. She arrived looking simultaneously terrified and exhilarated, a journalist's nose for a massive story overriding her survival instincts. When she saw the documents, her eyes went wide. "This is bigger than I thought," she breathed, reading through the papers. "This isn't just territorial corruption. This is systematic theft backed by the highest levels of government. This is—" She looked up at Garrett. "This is the kind of story that ends careers and starts investigations and maybe changes how the entire country thinks about Indian treaties." "Can you make copies?" Garrett asked. "I can do better than that," Mendez said. "I can set the type and print hundreds of copies, full documentation, every letter and deed and survey. It'll take all night, but by morning I can have packages ready to distribute." "Webb will try to stop you," Gideon warned. "Let him try," Mendez said with a grim smile. "I've been waiting my whole career for a story important enough to die for. This is it." They moved the operation to a barn on the outskirts of Santa Fe, a location easier to defend than the newspaper office. Mendez brought her printing equipment while Apache warriors established a defensive perimeter. The deputies took turns standing guard while others helped with the physical labor of printing. Gideon found himself feeding paper into the press, while Naeli carried finished pages to a drying area. It was mundane work, repetitive and tiring, but there was something profound about it too. Each page that came off the press was another copy of the truth, another piece of evidence that couldn't be silenced or disappeared. "You realize Webb knows what we're doing," Naeli said during one of their brief rest periods. "He has spies, informants. By now he knows we're printing documents and preparing to distribute them." "I know, Gideon said. "Question is, what will he do about it?" The answer came 2 hours before dawn. The sentries saw them first 30 riders approaching from Santa Fe, moving fast and quiet. Not militia in uniform, but hired guns, the kind of men who did wet work for high pay and no questions asked. They came with torches and weapons, clearly intending to burn the barn and everyone in it. But Whitehawk's warriors were ready. They'd been expecting this, had positioned themselves precisely for it. When the hired guns rode into range, the warriors opened fire from concealment with disciplined precision. The result was carnage. Half the attackers went down in the first volley. The rest scattered, trying to find cover that didn't exist, returning fire wildly at enemies they couldn't see. It was over in minutes. 15 men dead, 10 wounded and captured, 5 fled into the darkness and didn't look back. Inside the barn, the printing had continued without pause. Mendez had looked up at the first sounds of gunfire, nodded once, and gone back to work. She understood that the best response to violence was to finish the job before they could be stopped. By sunrise, they had 300 complete copies of the documents. Each package contained every letter, every forged deed, every piece of evidence that proved Webb's conspiracy. Mendez had even written a comprehensive article explaining the context and significance, making the documents accessible to readers who might not understand legal language. "This is enough," Garrett said, looking at the stacks of packages. "More than enough. Now we need to distribute them before Webb can organize another attack." Whitehawk had already assembled his fastest riders, 20 warriors on the best horses, each prepared to ride to a different town and deliver the documents to newspapers, telegraph offices, federal authorities, anyone who would listen and had the power to act. "They should go in pairs," Morrison suggested. "One Apache warrior, one deputy. Shows this is a united effort, not just an Indian uprising. Makes it harder for Webb to dismiss." It was smart thinking. The riders paired up quickly, warriors and deputies who'd fought together over the past week, who'd built trust through shared danger. Each pair received multiple packages with instructions to make their deliveries public and witness to ensure Webb couldn't intercept and destroy the evidence quietly. "What about Fletcher Knox?" Gideon asked. "And the other prisoners?" "They come with us," Garrett said. "We're taking them directly to Fort Union. It's a federal military installation 2 days northeast. Webb's influence doesn't reach there, and the commanding officer is someone I trust. We present the prisoners, present the evidence, and let the Army handle the investigation, since the Federal Marshal's Office has apparently decided to look the other way." "The Army," Whitehawk said skeptically. "The same Army that has driven my people onto reservations and broken every treaty it ever signed. The same Army that also has officers who believe in honor and law," Garrett said. "Not all of them, but enough. And right now, it's our best option." The riders departed at dawn, spreading out in all directions like seeds on the wind. Gideon watched them go and felt something that might have been hope. Each rider carried truth, and truth had a way of surviving even when the people who spoke it didn't. The journey to Fort Union began immediately. Garrett led the way with his remaining deputies while Whitehawk brought 30 warriors as escort. The prisoners traveled on the travois, again bound and guarded. And Gideon rode beside Naeli, the woman who'd gone from corpse to ally to something he didn't have words for yet. "When this is over," Naeli said as they rode, "what will you do?" "Go back to my 12-cent cabin, I suppose," Gideon said. "Assuming it's still standing. Build a life. Try to forget the past week happened." "You will not forget," Naeli said with certainty. "No one forgets the moment they discover who they truly are. And you discovered you are the kind of man who cannot walk past suffering, the kind who stands for what is right even when it costs everything. That is not something you can forget or ignore. It is who you are now." "What about you?" Gideon asked. "What happens to you when this is over?" Naeli looked toward her grandfather riding ahead, then at the warriors surrounding them, then at the open land that had once belonged to her people and might never be truly theirs again. "I will help my people navigate whatever comes next," she said. "If Webb falls, if the lands are returned, we will need people who can read the white man's documents and speak his language and ensure we are not cheated again. If Webb survives, if nothing changes, we will need warriors who remember what we fought for and why we cannot surrender." She paused. "Either way, my path is with my people, as yours is with your principles." It wasn't what Gideon wanted to hear. Some foolish part of him had started to imagine a future where Naeli was part of his life, where the bond forged through crisis continued into peace. But he understood. She had responsibilities, loyalties, a role to play in her people's survival. And he had his 12-cent cabin and whatever life he could build from the ashes of who he'd been. They rode in silence after that, each lost in thoughts about futures that might never come. Fort Union appeared on the horizon late the next day, a sprawling military installation that housed maybe 500 soldiers and represented federal authority in its most concrete form. As they approached, Gideon saw sentries scrambling to respond to the sight of Apache warriors riding toward the fort alongside federal deputies and prisoners. The commanding officer met them at the gate, Colonel Richard Peyton, a career soldier with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd fought in the war and several Indian campaigns since. He looked at the unlikely group with undisguised confusion. "Marshal Garrett," Peyton said cautiously, "I received your telegram saying you were coming, but you didn't mention you'd be bringing an Apache war party." "Circumstances changed, Colonel," Garrett said. He dismounted and approached. "I need to speak with you privately. What I have to show you is sensitive and potentially explosive." "How explosive?" "Governor Webb and Judge Crane level explosive," Garrett said. "Systematic fraud, murder treaty violations, and conspiracy that reaches the Territorial Supreme Court." Peyton's expression shifted from confusion to serious attention. "Come inside. Bring your evidence and your witnesses." And he looked at Whitehawk. "Chief, you and your warriors are welcome to make camp near the fort. You have my word that no harm will come to you while you're here." "Your word," Whitehawk said. "We have heard many promises from Army officers. Few were kept." "I cannot answer for what others have done," Peyton said. "I can only give you my word and stand by it. That's all any man can offer." Whitehawk studied the colonel for a long moment, then nodded. "We will camp nearby, but we will be watching, and if treachery follows, it will be answered." They spent the rest of the day in the colonel's office. Garrett laid out everything: the documents, the timeline, the attacks they'd endured, the federal marshal's office abandoning the investigation. Peyton listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Garrett finished, Peyton stood and walked to his window, looking out at the parade ground where soldiers drilled in the afternoon sun. "What you're describing is treason," he finally said. "Not the legal definition, perhaps, but the spirit of it. Government officials betraying their oaths, stealing from people they're supposed to protect, murdering to cover their crimes." He turned back to Garrett. "And you're asking me to do what exactly? Arrest the territorial governor?" "I'm asking you to investigate," Garrett said. "You have authority here that's independent of territorial government. You can examine the evidence, interview prisoners, conduct a real investigation without Webb's interference. Then you can report your findings to Washington through military channels that Webb can't corrupt." "It's not that simple," Peyton said. "The Army isn't supposed to interfere in civilian governance. That's how democracies die, when the military starts deciding which civilian leaders are legitimate." "With respect, Colonel," Gideon spoke up, "this isn't about interfering with civilian governance. This is about investigating crimes that fall under federal jurisdiction because they involve Indian treaties. Treaties the Army is sworn to enforce." Peyton looked at Gideon, really looked at him for the first time. "And you are—" "Nobody important," Gideon said. "Just a rancher who bought a cabin for 12 cents and found himself in the middle of something much bigger. But I've spent the last week watching good people die for truth, while powerful people killed to protect lies. So forgive me if I'm not concerned about procedural niceties when those niceties are exactly what men like Webb hide behind." A smile flickered across Peyton's face. "Well said." He returned to his desk and sat down heavily. "All right, I'll investigate. I'll interview your prisoners, examine your documents, and compile a report. But understand this will take time. Days at minimum, possibly weeks. And during that time, Webb will be working every angle he has to undermine, discredit, or simply destroy what you've built." "We've already distributed copies of the documents," Garrett said. "By now they should be reaching newspapers across the territory. Webb can't suppress them all." "No," Peyton agreed. "But he can control the narrative. Paint you as rogue lawmen. Paint the Apache as violent savages. Paint himself as the reasonable authority trying to maintain order in chaos." He sighed. "This is going to get very ugly before it gets better. If it gets better." That night, Gideon sat outside the fort with Naeli, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The Apache camp was visible in the distance, fires glowing warm against the cooling night. Inside the fort, Garrett and his deputies were finally getting real rest, sleeping in actual beds with real security for the first time in over a week. "Do you think it will work?" Naeli asked. "All of this, the documents, the investigation, the hope that truth will win?" "I don't know," Gideon admitted. "I want to believe it will. I want to believe the system can work when forced to confront its own corruption. But I've seen too much of how power protects itself to be confident."
Then why do it? Nayeli asked. Why fight so hard for an outcome you doubt will happen? Because the alternative is giving up, Gideon said. Accepting that might makes right. Accepting that people like Webb can do whatever they want to, whomever they want without consequence. And I can't accept that. Won't accept that. Even if we lose, even if Webb walks away clean and nothing changes, at least we'll have proven that not everyone stays silent, that some people still stand up. That is very noble, Nayeli said. Also very likely to get you killed. Probably, Gideon agreed. He looked at her, this woman who'd been left to die and refused, who'd fought beside him through impossible odds, who'd become more important to him than he wanted to admit given that their paths would soon diverge. What about you? Do you think your grandfather will get his lands back? No, Nayeli said bluntly. I think Webb is too powerful, too connected, too entrenched. I think the most we can hope for is that he stops actively stealing more land, that future treaties are watched more carefully, that other tribes learn from our experience and protect themselves better. She paused. Small victories. Not justice, but survival. Sometimes that is enough. They sat in silence after that, watching the night deepen and the stars multiply until the sky looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. Somewhere in Santa Fe, Webb was probably planning his next move. Somewhere in Washington, bureaucrats were deciding whether to support or abandon the investigation. Somewhere across the territory, writers were delivering documents that would change conversations and maybe possibly change minds. But here in this moment, there was just the night and the stars, and two people who'd found themselves on the same side of a fight neither had chosen, but both refused to abandon. Thank you, Gideon said quietly. For what? For not dying when I cut you down from that gate, he said. For fighting beside me. For giving me something worth fighting for. He looked at her. I was already dead when I bought that cabin. You brought me back to life. So thank you. Nayeli reached out and took his hand the first time she'd done that, the first purely gentle gesture between them that wasn't about strategy or survival. Her hand was rough from weapons and work warm, despite the cooling night, and absolutely solid. You are welcome, she said, and thank you for seeing me as a person worth saving instead of a problem worth ignoring. In a world that often treats my people as obstacles to be removed, you treated me as someone worth dying for. That is a gift I will not forget. They sat like that, hands joined, until the chill drove them back inside to separate quarters and separate futures that might never intersect again. The investigation took 12 days. 12 days of Peyton methodically interviewing every prisoner, examining every document, cross-referencing dates and signatures and details. 12 days of Webb sending increasingly threatening telegrams that Peyton ignored with military precision. 12 days of waiting to see if truth would triumph or if power would find a way to bury it one more time. During those 12 days, newspapers across the territory published the documents. The Santa Fe Gazette led the way with Catherine Mendez writing a series of articles that laid out the conspiracy in damning detail. Other papers picked up the story. Telegraph lines hummed with outrage and demands for investigation. Webb responded by claiming the documents were forgeries, that Knox was a rogue agent acting without authorization, that the whole thing was an Apache uprising designed to steal land back through fraud and violence. Some people believed him, the ones who wanted to believe him, who needed to believe that their governor wasn't a criminal. But more people didn't. Public opinion began to shift slowly but unmistakably. The tide was turning. On the 13th day, Colonel Peyton called Garrett, Gideon, and Whitehawk into his office. His face was grim but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd done hard work and knew it mattered. I've completed my investigation, Peyton said. The evidence is overwhelming. Webb and Crane orchestrated a systematic theft of Apache lands through forged documents and fraudulent transactions. Samuel Hartwell discovered the conspiracy and was murdered for it. Fletcher Knox and his men carried out that murder along with numerous other crimes, including the attempted murder of Miss Nayeli, the attacks on your column, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. What happens now, but? Garrett asked. Now I submit my report to the Secretary of War and the Justice Department, Peyton said. With a recommendation for immediate federal prosecution of Governor Webb, Judge Crane, and everyone involved in the conspiracy. I'm also recommending that the Army be deployed to secure Apache lands,
pending resolution of legitimate land claims, and that federal marshals be assigned to investigate territorial corruption more broadly. Will it work? Gideon asked. I don't know, Peyton admitted. Politics is messy. Power protects itself. Webb will fight this with everything he has, lawyers, influence, money, but he's fighting from a position of exposure now instead of shadow. That makes a difference. Not enough of a difference, Whitehawk said quietly. You are telling me that justice is possible but not certain, that my people's lands might be returned but probably will not be, that the truth has been revealed but the consequences remain unclear. Yes, Peyton said. That's exactly what I'm telling you. I wish I could promise more, but I won't lie to you. The system is slow, imperfect, and often corrupted by the people it's supposed to restrain. All I can promise is that I've done everything in my power to force it to work correctly this time. Whitehawk stood and walked to the window, looking out at his warriors camped beyond the fort's walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations of disappointment and hard-earned wisdom. For 200 years, my people have watched white men make promises and break them, make treaties and violate them, make laws and ignore them when convenient. We have learned not to trust words, only actions. So I will wait to see what actions follow your report, Colonel. If justice comes, I will be surprised but grateful. If it does not, he turned back to face them. Then my people will know finally and completely that we can expect nothing from white man's law but betrayal. No one had an answer to that. It was simply the truth, stark and uncomfortable and impossible to refute. They left Fort Union the next day, the investigation complete, but the outcome uncertain. Garrett and his deputies would return to Santa Fe to face whatever consequences came from their actions. Whitehawk and his warriors would return to their people to wait and see if the system would deliver even a fraction of the justice it promised. And Gideon would return to his 12-cent cabin, assuming Webb's men hadn't burned it down in the past 2 weeks. The ride back was quieter than the ride out had been. Everyone was exhausted physically from 2 weeks of constant vigilance emotionally, from the roller coaster of hope and disappointment spiritually, from confronting the gap between what should be and what was. They parted ways at the crossroads north of Liberty. Garrett headed southwest toward Santa Fe. Whitehawk headed northwest toward Apache territory. And Gideon headed west toward a cabin he'd bought for pocket change and a life he'd barely started before it got interrupted by conspiracy and violence. Nayeli rode with him for the first mile in silence. Then she stopped her horse. This is where we part, she said. I know, Gideon replied. You could come with us, Nayeli said. My people would welcome you. You have proven yourself a friend to the Apache. You could build a life among us. It was tempting. God, it was tempting, but Gideon shook his head. I've got land, he said. 12 cents worth. It's not much, but it's mine. And after months of having nothing that means something, I need to see if I can make something of it. Need to prove to myself that I can build instead of just surviving. I understand, Nayeli said. Then she leaned over, pulled him close, and kissed him brief, fierce, full of all the things they couldn't say and wouldn't promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. You are a good man, Gideon Hale. A rare man. Do not let the world make you forget that. You're a remarkable woman, Gideon said. Don't let anyone make you forget that either. She smiled, turned her horse, and rode away toward her grandfather's retreating column. Gideon watched until she was just a distant figure, then turned his own horse toward Liberty and whatever remained of the life he'd tried to start. The cabin was still standing when he arrived. Bullet holes in the walls, bloodstains on the porch. The gate beam where Nayeli had hung now bearing rope burns but standing. Someone had cleaned up the worst of the damage, probably Hiram Teague being decent again when no one was watching. Gideon dismounted and stood looking at his property. 12 acres of land, a cabin that had witnessed violence and conspiracy, a barn that still smelled of smoke from Samuel Hartwell's murder, a well that still worked, trees that still grew, land that could still support life if someone was willing to work for it. It wasn't much, but it was his. He spent the next weeks rebuilding, repairing walls, cleaning bloodstains, replacing broken windows, planting crops that might or might not grow, slowly, painfully turning the site of tragedy into the foundation of something new. News filtered in gradually. Webb had been arrested, released on bail, and was fighting extradition to federal court. Judge Crane had resigned and disappeared, probably to Mexico. Fletcher Knox had been convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. The territorial government was in chaos, with half the officials implicated in the conspiracy resigning or being forced out. But the Apache lands hadn't been returned. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The courts were still arguing about jurisdiction and legitimate claims and a dozen other legal technicalities that meant more waiting, more hoping, more disappointment. Small victories, Nayeli had said. Not justice, but survival. 6 months after he'd bought the cabin, Gideon sat on his rebuilt porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red. He'd planted crops, built a fence, started saving for cattle. The land was slowly becoming a home instead of just a property. He heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a rider approaching. For a moment, hope surged. Maybe Nayeli had come back, maybe she'd decided. But it wasn't Nayeli. It was Hiram Teague, the county clerk, who'd sold him the land in the first place. "Mr. Hale," Teague said, dismounting. "Got something for you." He handed over an envelope. Official seal, federal letterhead. Gideon opened it with hands that suddenly shook. It was a deed. Not to his 12 acres, he already owned those, but to an additional 100 acres adjacent to his land, granted by the federal government in recognition of his service in exposing corruption and protecting Apache treaty rights. Land that was good, fertile, well-watered. Land that could support a real ranch, a real life. "There's more," Teague said. "Webb's been convicted. Federal court. Conspiracy, fraud, about 20 other charges. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Judge Crane was arrested in El Paso trying to flee to Mexico. He's headed to trial next month. And the Apache," he paused, "they're getting about half their stolen lands back. Not everything, but enough that they can sustain themselves without depending on reservation rations." "Half," Gideon said. "That's something." "More than anyone expected," Teague said. "White Hawk is calling it a beginning. Says his people have learned to use white man's law against itself, and they won't stop fighting until all the lands are returned. But it's a start." After Teague left, Gideon sat holding the deed and watching the stars emerge. 112 acres total now. Enough to build a real life, enough to matter. The legend of the 12-cent cabin had spread across the territory and beyond. People told the story of the broke rancher who'd bought cursed land and found himself in the middle of a conspiracy. They told of the Apache woman who'd refused to die. They told of the marshal who'd chosen principle over career. They told of the battle for truth against power, and how sometimes, not always, but sometimes truth could win if people were willing to fight for it. Years later, when Gideon was old and gray, and the cabin had expanded into a proper ranch house, people would still come to see the place where it all started. The gate where Nayeli had hung, now bearing a carved wooden sign that read, "Freedom," in both English and Apache. The cabin where the documents had been hidden, the land that a broke rancher had bought for 12 cents and defended with his life. Nayeli visited sometimes, riding in from the reservation where her people had rebuilt their lives with the returned lands. She never stayed long. Both of them had responsibilities, separate lives, paths that had diverged after those intense weeks of shared danger. But they remained friends, allies, witnesses to each other's survival. And on quiet evenings, Gideon would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee and remember. Remember the terror of cutting down a dying woman from a gate. Remember the siege of the cabin and the ride to Santa Fe. Remember standing in a plaza facing down a governor while Apache warriors watched from the shadows. Remember choosing again and again to stand for what was right, even when it cost everything. He'd paid 12 cents for land, and it had cost him blood, sweat, fear, and the comfortable numbness of not caring about anything. But it had given him back his soul, given him purpose, given him a story worth telling and a life worth living. Out west, in the territory that was becoming a state in the land where Apache and settlers and soldiers and ranchers all tried to coexist on ground stained with violence and hope. In equal measure, the 12-cent cabin stood as a reminder that sometimes the cheapest things you buy cost you everything, that sometimes the smallest actions cascade into movements that change the world, that sometimes one person broke and desperate and clinging to the last remnants of principle could make a difference. Because Gideon Hale had bought a cabin for 12 cents, and in doing so, he'd bought himself a war, a purpose, a legend, and ultimately redemption. The price had been steep, the cost had been dear, but standing on his porch looking at land he'd earned through courage rather than currency, he knew it had been worth it. Every cent, every drop of blood, every moment of terror and triumph, all of it. The 12-cent cabin had become the birthplace of justice, however imperfect, and its owner had become something more than a broke rancher with nothing to lose. He'd become a man who'd stood for truth when it mattered most, a man who'd looked at suffering and couldn't walk away, a man who'd paid the smallest price for the most valuable thing in the world, the right to look himself in the mirror and see someone worth being. That was the real legend of the 12-cent cabin. Not the violence or the conspiracy or even the triumph of truth over power. It was simpler and more profound than any of that. It was the story of a man who'd been dead inside, finding a reason to live. And discovering in that search that sometimes the things that cost us everything are precisely the things that give us back ourselves.